Okay, are we good?
All right, I think that you are all set, Miguel. It's all you. Take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of our annual Soil Health Symposium, sponsored by the North Coast Soil Health Hub. We are very excited to have you back. And if you didn't join us yesterday, welcome. Before we get started, I want to go through a couple of housekeeping Zoom notes. First, if you notice on the bottom portion of your screen, you have 2 separate buttons, Q&A and chat. We ask you to please only use the Q&A for your questions. If you put it in the chat, we may not see it. So the chat will be utilized to pass on information to you. We'll have the agenda there. We'll have our speakers' bios. And if you have just general comments, you can leave them there. Q&A button will be used strictly for questions. So please make sure that you are using those buttons accordingly. Besides that, I want to remind everybody we had a full agenda yesterday. We recorded the session yesterday. We'll be recording the session today. The video from yesterday could be found in our website, soilhub.org, most likely by the end of today. And the recording from today will be most likely available by the end of Monday. We will be sending you a survey to learn a little bit about your experience on our symposium in the next couple of weeks or so, and the links for those videos would be attached to that. So keep an eye for that, and we really appreciate your time in completing the survey. It allows us to learn how we did and improve for future symposiums. So thank you for that. Yesterday, we had an action-packed agenda. We heard from many speakers on a global perspective on climate impacts to the viticulture industry. And we had a lot of perspectives on that. We heard yesterday how climate change has the potential to adversely impact agricultural productivity, not only at the local, but regional and global scales through alterations in rainfall patterns, more frequent occurrences of climate extremes, altered patterns of pest pressure, and changes in seasonal and diurnal temperature patterns. We also heard yesterday how enhancing soil health can help farmers adapt to climate change impacts. Healthy soils can store more carbon, absorb and retain more water, and are more resilient against weather extremes. Today, we will be a little bit closer to home, and we'll have a grower's perspective on the implementation of sustainable management practices in vineyards and how these practices benefit soil health. We will also hear from our growers about the economics and marketability of sustainable farming practices. And we will hear how implementing sustainable farming practices is not only good for the soil, but can also be good for business. We have a great agenda prepared for you today with exceptional speakers. We're very thankful for everybody that is going to join us today, all the speakers. We're very thankful. We really appreciate your time, and we really appreciate giving us your perspective on how you implement sustainable practices in your operation and how you see benefits for your soil health. The first section of today will be a panel of growers talking about their experiences with undervine management. And for this panel, we will have Keith Abels from Sonoma RCD as the moderator. And we will have members from different vineyards around the North Coast. We will have Kari Flores from Robertsinski Vineyards, Ned Horton from Turley Wine Cellars, and Stuart Bewley from Alder Springs Vineyards. So Keith, please take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Miguel, for introducing the program. And thank you very much to our panelists. We have 3 really great growers here to share their experience of managing under the vine. How to best manage under the vine is a big question for really all growers. So it'll be great to hear their perspective. And we definitely want folks' participation and questions. So in the bottom right of your screen, please enter the question and answer, any questions you have. And after you will hear from each panelist. Each panelist is going to get 5 minutes to kind of share their thoughts and perspective, tell you a little bit about where they're farming. And then we have a set of question answers that I will be asking that we already have prepared. And then we will have question and answer from the group. So please put your questions there. And with that, let's hear from Kari Flores first about her experience with Under the Vine management. Thank you, Kari.
Hi, thank you for having me here. This has been a very interesting symposium so far. I tuned in yesterday and really enjoyed that. And so I just wanted to talk about Robert Sinskey Vineyard's experiences from transitioning from conventional to organic. Our oldest vines were planted in 1990, and Rob Sinskey came to Napa Valley from New York City, where he was a fancy photojournalist, and he was going to help his family start vineyards. And of course, he knew nothing about vineyards, and so they farmed, what is called conventionally, from 1990 through that whole decade, conventionally. And in the 90s, there were 2 100-year floods, one in 1995 and one in 1997. And they were doing the whole undervine strip spray with Roundup, like everybody who comes to Napa Valley, they want to know what equipment you're going to use for your strip spray. And so what they found was that this was out on Las Amigas Road in Carneros. And they found that their soils just washed away in any heavy rains and just washed on down to the swamp. And so around the same time, they had a young winemaker come. He was like the youngest winemaker in Napa Valley at the time, Jeff Vernig. And Rob and Jeff were soon to be new fathers, and they were interested in nutrition for their children. And Jeff was kind of a proponent to Rob for going organic, and he was also a follower of Rodale, J.I. Rodale, the original founder of the Rodale Institute. And so he proposed to Rob to go organic, that they were seeing a lot of benefit to the soil to retain their soil and not have it wash away by using weird things at the time, like cover crops and no-till systems. And so Rob, was amenable to trying different things at the time. So they started doing what became regenerative agriculture, even though there wasn't a name for it. And they started doing things like agroecology before there was even a name for it. So in 2000, they decided to go fully certified organic. And then there was another 100-year flood in 2005, and they found that the soil stayed in place with organic cover crops and not strip spraying. So what we do for undervine now is, not probably what most people would call economically feasible. We use Palanque sunflower undervine cultivators. We have a Fisher mower that mows under the vine. We chop all of our prunings in place with flail mowers. And we found that, we've gotten more efficient at it. And yes, the Palanque undervine cultivators are a little pricey and a little difficult to maintain, especially now that they're discontinued. But we make it work, and we find that we're able to farm, fairly economically feasibly with using these methods instead of strip spray. And it has benefited our vineyards enormously. I see about a foot difference in the soil height between our conventionally farmed neighbors and our vineyards where their soil just continues to be lost through erosion and runoff, and all of the plowing and disking that they do. That's another thing that we don't do. We do just conservation spading every other row on our flatter blocks, the less than 5% slope. And then we have no-till on our hillside vineyards. And that has made a huge difference. In 2001, we incorporated sheep, and everybody's worried about salt content, but we found that our salt content actually dropped after we started incorporating sheep and using less chemical fertilizers. Our nitrogen levels have stayed stable, even though we only apply compost and sheep deposits to our vineyards.
Great, Kari. You have another minute or two, but are you done?
I think I'm finished for now.
Okay, that's great. There'll be more questions for sure.
Right.
We're going to hear next from Ned Horton from Turley Wine Cellars. I have had the good fortune to know Ned for a while. I first met him when I was with the Santa Rosa Junior College Vit class that visited his vineyard, and I thought he had a great program going and was very coherent. But then I've got to work with him quite a bit when he was with Quivera in Sonoma County, and he has had a lot of experience with under the vine management, organic management, and trying different things. So Ned, thank you very much for going out of your way to join us today, and take it away, Ned.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Keith, for having me. I'm, like Keith said, I'm a vineyard manager here at Turley. It's just about a year now, my first year here. Prior to that, 11 years in Dry Creek Valley working at organic sites. Here at Turley, we manage about 108 acres, 5 in Napa, 5 sites in Napa, 3 in Sonoma County, all CCOF certified. And what's particularly interesting about the sort of diversity here at Turley is vines from 4 years old to over 100 years old. So when you're working near the vines, especially with the old vines, you've really got to be kind of conscious of what you're doing. I thought the best way for me to kind of approach today's talk would be to go through the types of machines I've worked with for undervine cultivation over the year, and kind of give everyone a little explanation of how they work and what I see as benefits and kind of complications that can arise from using different approaches. So the first machine you see here is called a Gearmore hoe plow. And I only actually have about 2 seasons worth of experience with this machine. It is very effective at moving dirt, soil out from under the vines to a pretty good depth. It's, leaves a very clean path in its wake. It can be kind of slow, and it requires a lot of attention from the operator. With this machine, the operator is actually going to be spending a lot of his day looking over his shoulder as he or she is driving. So it can be really kind of stressful physically on an operator. And as with most of these machines, the Gearmore can be really quite unforgiving if the sensor doesn't function properly and the plow ends up connecting with a vine. But the override on this is actually really quite responsive. So the downside of this one, and then also the next machine, which I have a photograph of, if we could see that. So this is another photo of the Gearmore, but then excuse me, one more, there we go. This is Agrifer Piccolo, which is a powered disc. This one has a relatively decent sensor and allows for a little bit speedier operation. So one of the sort of downsides in general of undervine cultivation versus a commercial approach would be it does take time, much more time. So a machine like this with a good sensor is like kind of a valuable asset. But the downside to this approach, which I believe the next photograph can illustrate, which is also a downside to the first machine, the gear more. Could we please see the next picture? Oops. So it looks like we missed something in here. Sorry, there we go, that one, thank you. So is that you've got to put the soil that you remove from under the vines, or in this case, this looks like a, I got this image from the internet, a dwarf apple espalier trellis, but you have to get the soil back under the vines. So in a alternating row situation, or just in general, it requires an extra step, which I, over time really migrated away from this approach, even though to what are called harrows, which as they move through the vine rows are really good at getting weeds out without moving the soil out from under the vine. So I believe in the next image, we have a video of a machine that I did run for a number of years in Dry Creek Valley that was pretty effective. I'm not sure if the video is going on. There we go. It was pretty effective at so unfortunately, it doesn't look like at least on my end, the video's running very smoothly. But one of the things I think that's telling about that video is that it's being used on young vines, which sort of reinforces the fact that the sensor there is very responsive. And then the final machine in the images is the Kimco, which we use here at Turley. So last year was my first year with this machine, and it is a very robust, super strong machine. And I'd say that's really one of its major benefits. Here in St. Helena, and then also on Howell Mountain, the soils are extremely rocky, and so not gravelly, but big rocks. And so it really is important to have a machine that can withstand contact with big rocks, of course, a day. So so the Kimco is really, really good for that. It does run slower than some of the other machines that kind of preceded it in this discussion, but it is very sensitive and it is very strong. And then just sort of to kind of conclude my little chat here about undervine cultivation, and I'm going to assume people here are just kind of looking for basic information. One of the real important things is timing. So, with all cultivation, soil moisture is very important. With undervine cultivation, it's really great if you can just limit it to one pass a year. So it's trying to get in there while there's still some moisture in the soil, but late enough in the season that you won't get any subsequent germination is a really important call to make. And then the other thing to keep in mind is if the cover crop or the weeds under the vine get too big or are also woody, they can trigger the sensor arm, which can leave a lot more cleanup work to be done after the machine passes through. Other things to mention are, infrastructure has to be arranged to accommodate the machine. So if there's drip hose or arms from head trained vines, those are things you're going to need to consider before you bring a machine in to cultivate a vineyard. Really good operator training and getting a really good, really focusing on speed. What's a safe speed to run the machine at without hurting the vines, and then sensor adjustment to make sure that as the machine's moving through, it's really responding to, the sensor is responding to contacting the vines and not letting the harrow or the plow touch the vines, because in all cases with all this equipment, the equipment will chew up and spit out T-posts and vines in the blink of an eye. So it's really important to try to have all those things sorted out. So Keith, that's sort of my overview of machines I've used in the past.
Okay, thank you very much, Ned. That was really helpful to see those photos. I think it helps to get an image of what we're talking about. So thank you for sharing that and your experience. And we're going to hear from Stuart Bewley from Alder Springs Vineyard next. And then after we heard from him, I'll be asking some more questions. And then please populate the question and answer section of your Zoom, because I imagine there'll be quite a few from the attendees, and we want to hear what they are. Okay, thank you. Stuart, take it away.
Thank you very much for including me in this great program. Alder Springs Vineyard is located quite north in Mendocino County. All hillside vineyards. Most of our vineyards are in the range of 15 to 30% slope. And as a result of that, and we're also in a fairly high rainfall area, we have quite a number of salmon streams and steelhead spawning streams in the area of our vineyard. So we try and be very careful not to create any erosion. We've run a permanent cover crop for 28 years. We've never tilled the vineyard at all since the original establishment of each block. And we run a permanent cover crop between the rows of perennial bunch grasses and clovers primarily. Undervine, we have done a number of things, and we're trying to go towards a more sustainable and program under vine. The photograph you see here was an application of compost under vine. Now this was at the bottom of a hill in winter, and it was a pretty wet winter, but you can see where a certain percentage of the compost was kind of washed away by rain coming down the hill. Even though we have a nice permanent cover crop there, it just didn't seem satisfactory to us. And we've been working on all sorts of ideas for about 10 years to try and improve the undervine treatment. And we've tried a number of things, including compost, which obviously is great, but then we tried a method of about 3 or 4 inches of compost, and then we went over it with about 4 inches of wood chips for a mulch. Now this is right next door to the area that was, you could see where it was kind of eroding a little bit or taking away the compost. And this area seemed to do far better. And we also found that this conserved moisture tremendously. And we had really excellent earthworm populations, and it seemed to really hold the moisture in very well, seemed to protect the soil very well. It did take a heck of a lot of wood chips. I think we put on about 300 yards of wood chips per acre, something like that. It was just a mountain of wood chips. Fortunately, wood chips are fairly inexpensive in our area, at least. And so this has been one of the undervine treatments that we've done. We've done, obviously we've done no tilling at all. We found that in our area, if we did till, it just takes the soil right out from underneath the vines. Perhaps the method that we've tried that we're quite excited about is growing crops under vine. And we tried about 40 different species of plants. And this is a combination of clover and alyssum that you can see here. We've been working on this for about 10 years, and this worked out pretty well. Alyssum sometimes doesn't come back as well, but we include it in our mix at least. And we were looking for low growing plants that were not too aggressive. We did try perennial bunch grasses, and it seemed to, they have such aggressive and deep roots, it seemed to devigorate our vines significantly. Now this, we call this the experiment block at Alder Springs, and we grew about 20 different species. The ones that seemed to come out quite well were Dutch white clover, subclovers, and also Roman chamomile did pretty well, as well as alyssum. And one of the things we noted was that it did devigorate the vines a little bit for the first 2 seasons. So it'd be helpful to add some kind of a nitrogen to make sure you didn't shorten the shoots and things like that. But it seemed like the vines kind of adjusted to the process.
Can folks hear me okay? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you. We
Yeah.
just lost him. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to Stuart.
I think his video just froze.
Yeah,
I don't know if we want to wait it out or if we want to move forward. I don't know.
Yeah, let's ask some questions of the other panelists and see if he doesn't come back. Let's stay on that topic though. That's a really important topic. And I imagine Kari and Ned, you've dealt with this. Like, have you tried to establish grasses or other plants underneath the vine? And have you, what if you have had success with? What do you think are good plants, or what are poor choices?
Do you want
Let's
me to?
hear from Kari first.
Okay. It's problematic for us because we put sheep through our vineyards. What was his name? Miguel Altieri tried to do some floral resource planting in our vineyards, and it just didn't work for us because the sheep come through and then just eat everything anyway. So we haven't really done anything other than our cover cropping under the vines.
Okay, let's hear from Ned, and then we'll give Stuart a chance to see if his audio works again after Ned gives his response.
Sure. I don't have any direct experience planting under vine, though it does look like a very attractive solution for a lot of different situations. I have seen it work successfully. My understanding is, and I think Stuart was alluding this, it takes a while to get, seasons to get an established crop that's appropriate under vine. But that to me looks like a really, great way of, in some situations, particularly where there's erosion potential.
Great, thank you. Stuart, let's give you another chance. You were speaking about the alyssum and under the vine when you cut out, and hopefully your video works now. And if it doesn't, we'll just get back to some other questions, but take it away, Stuart. Good luck.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, we did do the undervine different plantings. We used a Fisher twister for mowing the undervine, and our objective was to mow over the top of the planting. And there's a Fisher twister. It shows the spinning unit, which is kind of a heavy cord like a weed whacker. The unit itself is spring operated. It's not with a trip sensor, and it just goes around the vine. There was also a machine that Golden Vineyards, I noticed, had developed. This was a adapted Gearmore machine. Gearmore doesn't make this machine, but the vineyard manager at Golden Vineyards in north of Ukiah produced this machine, and it was kind of a disc on each side, and it was run on a SVL type tracked machine. It did quite a good job, and I'm looking to build one of these, I hope. It went pretty fast and seemed to do a really good job under the vine. This was photograph was taken at a event that Glenn McGorty put on up in Mendocino County. But right now we're using the Fisher Twister, and the Fisher Twister primarily is just being used to take out any weeds that grow higher than the cover crop. And so we don't take out the cover crop at all. We just let it go back to seed, and it acts as it develops some flowers and so forth. You can see this was right after it was mowed, and in the spring we probably do 2 mowings, maybe 3 would probably be better. Now you'll notice the drip hose has to be raised up a little higher than what would be normal. We put it up at about 24 inches, and the Fisher Twister does require a fair bit of space to get under the vines and so forth. One of the advantages of the Fisher Twister I found was it actually, those units, those orange items there hit the vine itself, and they kind of sucker the vine if you get it in spring, and they'll take off some of the lower suckers. They don't do a perfect job, but they probably reduce the cost of suckering somewhat, especially when they're in that vulnerable stage where they'll snap off relatively easily. Although right down by the ground, because we don't mow very low, they obviously don't take it off. But we found this system to be quite workable so far, and we're going to we've got about 35 acres this year that we've gone to this system. The one thing I like about this system is that because you're not tilling, you are allowing your fungal soil biology to prosper, whereas when you till, you have a tendency to favor bacteria, which are good, but grapevines are fungally dominant, and by tilling under the vine, it doesn't do the fungus very good because you're kind of chopping it up a little bit. So I'm not sure if this works per se. Much better. I don't have enough years of experience with it, but the theory at least is that you're helping the biology in the soil, as well as protecting the soil, and as well as not having to use chemicals.
Great, thank you, Stuart. That was really good, and thanks for bearing with us when you had that glitch with your audio. The question I have is, no one spoke to chemicals, whether conventional or organic. If we could do a go around, starting with Kari, then Ned, then Stuart, about experience maybe you've had with either conventional or organic chemicals. And so what are some of the advantages and disadvantages, pluses and minuses you're seeing chemicals versus these types of mechanical situations and mulch that you're talking about?
I've only farmed organically ever for 20 years. So I really can't compare and contrast, but we did try that weed slayer last year, and it was effective, but the grass or the weeds grew back fairly quickly with it. But I find mechanical pruning, undervine management to be highly effective, and I don't really see the need for undervine chemical treatments.
Ned, we'd like to hear from you.
Well, Kari, I don't have experience with chemical management. So I really can't speak to, personal experience.
Stuart, have you used chemicals before?
I have. We've used chemicals, Roundup primarily, or and some other chemicals occasionally. They're inexpensive, they're effective, but I don't think that they're the best thing either for the soil. And, I think that the world is changing and our winery clients are really interested in moving away from Roundup and other chemicals. And it seems to be a trend that is building and has been building over the years. And that's why we started to look in another direction. And but I think that the chemicals definitely are effective and they're definitely inexpensive. They just, they're probably not the best for the vines. They're probably not the best for the wine quality. And they're certainly not the best for the environment.
Okay, I have one more question related to that, Stuart, and it's really kind of two pieces of it, is that I often in vineyards see where people have been using, either pre-emergence and or more Roundup types of chemicals, and you get kind of a more hardened zone with very few grasses. And it's like I say, it's hard. It's a brown and somewhat, I don't want to say concrete, but it's very hard. How do you, how would you rehabilitate that? And how do you establish grasses under the vine? What's the process of doing that in that zone?
I would say rehabilitating banding compost would be a nice start. And as a matter of fact, that's how we do our grasses also. We band about a little less than a truckload per acre. So that's about 25 tons per acre or somewheres in that range. And then we go through and mix up a mix of seed, and we put it in with a kind of a carrier, some other materials and so forth, maybe even compost and so forth. And then we put it on by hand, and then we rake it in with a very light rake, raking by hand. And you only have to do it once. So it's a little expensive to put it out on a per acre basis, but we, at the end of the season last year, now granted, we had forest fires and we didn't pick a lot of our grapes last year, like many people in the industry. So we had a little bit of time, and we went out and did about 20 acres last year, seeding under the vines, composting, and then raking it in lightly. Keith, you're on mute, I think.
It's interesting. Do either of the other panelists have comments on that? Okay. Seeing none, I'm wondering, have either of the other panelists, have you tried mulching under the vine? Has that been something you have experience with?
I have not, though I have seen something similar to what Stuart's done in Australia with oat straw and wheat straw, where they have machines that band under the vines a berm, basically almost 2 feet of straw, and it's really great for weed suppression and, as he was mentioning, soil moisture conservation. It's a really great way to keep the soil alive.
Okay. Good. That's good to know. And I think it's important to let the folks who are participating, that this might be old news to a lot of folks, but Weed Slayer was a relatively new product, and people were saying it was more effective than some of the other organic alternatives, but it was banned. People got a cease and desist letter in the past year. So that's an option that is off the table. So if any other folks, attendees, have other experiences with other alternatives to conventional chemicals that they might want to share, you might want to put that in the chat. So my next, I would like to return to you mentioned the rocky soil, Ned, and I've certainly seen some vineyards that, have quite a bit of rocks in there. I would like to hear from others. I don't know if Stuart or Kari deal with this, but you know, for hillside and rocky environments, like what can you tell folks on that are attending about like different approaches to manage this, and maybe what's worked and hasn't? Ned, maybe you want to go first.
There we go. Yeah. So in terms of, well, like I say, with the rocky soils and undervine cultivation, that Kimco seems to work really, really well. With hillside, you know, the steeper you get, the I would say the less attractive cultivation can become. So you know, limiting by either going kind of alternate row or just undervine would be great approaches. Also, in really tight spacings where there really isn't effective machinery right now for managing undervine, it's a little bit medieval, I guess, in a way. But weed eaters is another approach that that does work. Again, timing is really important, but yeah, I would say those, you know, for the hillsides, it's things change quite a bit, and erosion is a major concern.
Thank you. Do either of the other panelists want to comment on that?
We don't, Alder Springs, we don't really have a very rocky, big rocks or anything like that. We've got more of a gravelly type or loam soils. But we've found, at least, and now we have no experience whatsoever in cultivation, but we found that some of these undervine mowers, like the Fisher Twister and this one that the Golden Vineyard had developed, were pretty good at fairly tight spacing. We are at 3 feet between the vines, and we can get in and out of those things pretty effectively, and not at a great pace, probably similar to undervine cultivation, maybe a little faster. But that Fisher Twister does actually hit the vines themselves. So it kind of takes a touch of the bark off. But if you go too slow, it'll take too much bark off. So you actually have to go at a reasonable pace, about, let's say, 3 miles an hour. And that does sucker, but it also does take a little bit of the bark off. But so far, we have not seen that to be a problem at all.
Kari, it looked like you had a comment.
Oh, I was just going to say that the Pelonk sunflowers work fairly well on hillside, not too steep. Our steepest hillside, which is terraced, we actually do have to use weed whackers, and old-fashioned weed whackers work fine. You know, not for huge tracts of land, but for our smaller, you know, 4 or 5 acre vineyards, we get a crew out there. And then we also use shovel crews where we have super big vines. We spot weed with a shovel crew that goes through, you know, but that's not what you want to do for all of your larger vineyards, but it is effective too.
Okay.
Keith, we have 5 minutes left.
Okay, great. And I might start the question and answer a little bit early because we have quite a few that are building up, which is great. Thank you, folks, for participating and entering those. I'm wondering if any of the instruments you showed, I wasn't sure I saw mowers in there, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on mowing under the vine and what the options are there compared to some of these more cultivation types of opportunities, which approach is better. So maybe let's hear from Ned, then Kari, then Stuart.
Sure. I'm not sure I would necessarily go to better. I would say that different situations require different responses. Mowing and not cultivating is really attractive on a lot of different levels. I've definitely managed, you know, a 30-acre hillside vineyard with no cultivation and had some, you know, really great success in parts of the vineyards and moderate in others. But then I think other other vineyards respond well to cultivation, particularly with water demand. And I would say, here at Turley, old vine, dry farmed vineyards, we definitely favor cultivating those. Again, just trying to eliminate as much competition as possible.
I purchased a Fisher mower about, I think it was 3 years ago now, and it works fairly well, but you have to do it when the growth is fairly small. Otherwise, it doesn't. It's not as effective. So we try to get out there as soon as we can, when we can, after rains and the ground dries up and we can run a tractor over it. But that's my only mower that I have for under the vine. We've tried Chemcos and Bianos, and they're fairly difficult to maintain. So this is, the scheme that we've come up with is the Pelonk and the Fisher mower and weed whackers and shovel crew. And that's pretty much it.
Great, thank you. Stuart?
Well, we've got the Fisher Twister. Now we use a Chris Grow, an Australian version that is being made in Lodi for mowing between the rows, very heavy duty machine. The only undervine mower we currently have is the Fisher Twister, and it both mows the cover crop and under the vine simultaneously. And it's a little bit expensive. It's an expensive machine, about $26,000. It's handled in Sonoma County. There's a dealer, and they're pretty good guys to work with and so forth. It takes a little while to get the machine. I think it's been a good machine, but there are not a lot of machines out there. I think Perfect has a undervine that you can add on to their equipment. I have not tried that. It looks like a good machine though. And it's going to take us a little while to get much more experience. Most of our process was just trying to determine whether it really worked to have plants underneath the vine, or if it would devigorate it so much or become such a problem that we couldn't do it. So far, we're seeing fairly good results, but we don't have a lot of experience with a lot of different machines, frankly.
Great, thank you. That was excellent, all of you. That was all great stuff. And I want to turn it over to the question and answer from the attendees now. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to be turning it over to Anya Starovoitov, my coworker, but I do want to say before I do that, as I'm about to let Anya take the helm, that there's a lot of interest in this topic. And we at Sonoma RCD, we try to do quarterly soil health kind of topics. That COVID has changed that a bit, and the other RCDs involved with the North Coast Soil Hub are all doing a lot of good soil health workshops. And Under the Vine is something we really want to emphasize and help people understand, because there's a lot to it there, obviously. And I will say there's some great stuff happening in the chat and some comments going to the presenters as well. So everyone take a look there, but question and answer put there. And Anya, thank you so much for leading this part, and take it away.
Absolutely. There's lots of questions coming in, so I'll try to pick the more exciting ones. And I apologize ahead of time to folks that we will not be able to get to all the questions. The first one is actually for all three panelists. And the question is, how have the soil treatments you've applied, have you seen any results in notable changes on how much irrigation water is required for the vine? So are you seeing any changes in how much water you need to apply? And maybe we can start with Kari.
I wasn't around when they transitioned from conventional, but now we apply very little water, very little irrigation water, maybe about, in the very hottest months, 6 gallons a week per vine. but we don't start until maybe the middle of July, and a couple of times in August, and then maybe a little bit in September, and that's about it. So yeah, it does help retain water quite a bit. We do have a lot of organic matter in our soil, a lot of residual cover crop, and incorporated pruning. So I do think it helps quite a bit.
I would say it really, in my experience, it's very site dependent. So soil type, rootstock, cultivar, spacing. So in some situations, no-till, I think Stuart alluded to this, there may be a kind of an adjustment period for the vines, but then, they can go on to be, have a pretty well-adjusted existence without a lot of, or change in supplemental irrigation, or even dry farm in some situations. But other situations, that's, in my experience, has not been the case. And cultivation really does help minimize water demand.
Our experience is that we do not irrigate more in the blocks that we have the undervine cover crop. We do find that we can irrigate less where we put the wood chips. That really conserves the water. If I had a real water shortage issue, I think I might play around with that idea a little bit. It seems like the moisture holding capacity of that is excellent. I'm not sure that the weed suppression is always as excellent as the moisture holding capacity. Now we have a certain amount of gopher activity. They seem to disrupt the wood chips quite a bit, and that will allow some weeds to get going a little bit more. If you had some kind of a spot system where you could spot treat weeds, like vinegar or something like that, I think that might be effective in combination with the wood chips. So far, we're finding a little bit of weed escape with the wood chips. That's the one that really retains the water. The undervine cover crop, not so much. Where we are, we do have a lot of water, so it's not that big a problem. And we're also on devigorated rootstocks that are fairly shallow rooting, Riparia, 10114, 420A, that sort of thing. So, we don't have the 110Rs and the 140 rugaries that go real deep and are real ideal for dry farming. So the undervine cover crop does not conserve water per se.
All right, thank you all. Stuart, since you were just chatting about the mulch, let me throw another question. There's lots of questions coming in about the mulch. And so if you could maybe reemphasize what type of mulch or what the source is, and how often you've had to reapply, and whether you've seen any downsides with the mulch.
We got our mulch from a lumber mill, and those guys have a tendency to have tons of that stuff. They're sending truckloads of it all over the place. Where we are, we were paying about $500 a load plus trucking for the mulch, and now we were fairly close, so we were able to get it for about $700 a truckload. There's about 85 to 100 yards per truckload, so it's fairly lightweight, and it was a huge pile of for every truck. In this particular case, it was either Doug fir or redwood chips. We found that the chips persisted really well. We've been doing this for about, it was 8 years. We put the first application on just a few rows, and it seemed to persist very well. And you could hardly tell that they had deteriorated after 3 years. Now, we went back and top dressed it again right over the top. And that worked really well. I would say the downsides to the wood chips are, one, the piece of equipment that does the spreading has to be well suited to that. There's some spreaders that'll kind of bind up with the chips and stuff like that. The second thing is it does take a lot of chips. And the third thing is, the downside is you do get some escapes. The one thing is, if you have any guys in there, the weeds pull out so easily and quickly, it's amazing. Whereas if I'm trying to pull a weed in some just regular part of the vineyard, unless it's, you know, winter and the soil's really wet, you're not getting it out. But under those mulch, even in the late summer or fall, you can pull those weeds out just really easily.
All right, thank you for sharing that. All right, another question kind of broadly for the entire group is, could you speak to or give a rough sense of the cost per acre for the different treatments under the vine row that you've described that are sort of predominant in your management? And maybe we'll start with Ned.
I don't have those numbers at my fingertips. I'm kind of notorious for not carrying numbers in my head, but I will say again, you know, that can be highly variable depending on spacing and the machinery you're using, because essentially, you know, there's the initial investment in the equipment, and then it's a question of labor and maintenance.
How about Stuart or Kari? Could you speak to a little bit about costs?
I'm really sorry. I don't have the cost per acre either at my fingertips, but I know, you know, it's a little more expensive than just going and spraying Roundup, but I think overall it's better for the vines and the environment and the wine. So, you know, you have to balance that cost too. With your own economic costs. So I'm sorry, but the other thing that we do is, you know, having sheep, it reduces our mowing and undervine cultivation costs. I think we save about 2 passes. And somebody way back in the day, I think they came up with $500 an acre in savings, but I don't want to use that because I don't know I don't know what it is right now. So
We have 1 more minute.
Wait, I'm not going to give you much more information either. We don't have the costs either, and I do know that the undervine treatments, whether it's mowing or the mulch, is probably going to be a little more expensive than Roundup for sure. And now the mulch, the good part is we lay down a fair amount of compost first, and then we put the mulch over it. And that's to keep the mulch from devigorating the vines by pulling nitrogen out of the soil. But that's a fairly expensive process. However, after that, we really don't do hardly anything at all, except maybe try and deal with some of the escaped weeds. For a few years. So in a way, on a yearly basis, the mulch is cheaper, but the initial process is a little more expensive. But you are putting a massive amount of carbon onto the vineyard, because, you know, if you're talking 2 or 3 truckloads per acre at 85 to 100 yards per acre, per truckload, that's a lot of carbon. And but the costs are, once you've accomplished it, are lower.
All right, thank you. Well, it looks like we are unfortunately out of time for any more questions, and there's lots of great chatter in the Q&A, and I believe our panelists have access to that window. So if you did want to look in and see if you wanted to answer some of the questions directly. Otherwise, folks are suggested to just reach out to either the RCD or some of the panelists if you wanted to follow up on a question. And I will pass it back to Miguel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anya, and thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate your time and your perspective. We could easily fill up a whole day just talking about your different experiences. We hope that you got a perspective of what your peers are doing and hopefully gives you something to think about. So thank you so much. Up next, we have Kelly Mova from Piscina's Ranch. talking about regenerative wine growing, enhancing ecosystem health and profits by mimicking nature. For the past 25 years, Kelly has managed and consulted with vineyards, farms, and ranches throughout the Western US, Spain, Australia, and China. In 2012, he was sponsored by government and wine industry organizations to give presentations and workshops on extended season vineyard grazing throughout Australia and New Zealand. His studies include ecological horticulture at UC Santa Cruz, viticulture at UC Davis, and holistic management with Alan Savory. His work is focused on combining experience in farming and viticulture with holistic management in order to design and manage more ecologically, socially, and economically sound farming practices. This usually involves a considerable amount of help from livestock. Kelly is Vineyard Director of Piscina's Ranch and does design advising work for vineyards. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. Please take it away.
Thanks. Making sure everybody can hear me.
We hear you
Yes,
fine.
you're
Thank
good.
you.
Okay, thanks. Just a brief overview of Piscina's Ranch, where I'm at. We're south of Hollister, about 15 miles. This picture was taken during the dry season. Unfortunately, it doesn't look a lot different than that right now. But
Kelly, I'm sorry, we cannot see your screen. Would you please share your screen with your presentation?
oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
How's that?
We're still not seeing anything.
I can share it for if you'd like, Kelly. This is William from Goldridge.
Yeah, please go ahead, Will.
Oh, looks like he's got it.
Okay, good. All right. So the ranch is 7,600 acres. 600 acres of that is irrigated cropland. Formerly, there was 1,000 acres of wine grapes on here. It was part of Almaden Vineyards back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Those vines have been gone since probably the mid to late 80s. We are doing part of the crop farming ourselves, and we're also doing a pretty large sheep operation. We have about 16 to 1,800 ewes that we're going to lamb out this year, starting here pretty soon. I've been here for about 6 years now working on this vineyard project that you guys are going to hear about. The first slide I'm going to show is actually from Dr. Jones. And I just wanted to show this. That was a really great presentation he did yesterday. And some of the things that he was recommending for the way forward. The thing that really hit me about Dr. Jones's presentation was that the reality of climate change, it seems to be coming at us faster than we thought. And we can't continue doing the same things we've been doing and expect to get a different result. We really need to start thinking about a different way going forward for managing. This is kind of the driving question that we have at Piscina's Ranch, actually for all of our farming endeavors, but it started with our wine growing. And that is it possible to significantly increase ecosystem health while simultaneously maintaining or increasing profitability? Our premise is that in order to do that, we need to design and manage for effectively creating systems that take advantage of everything that's free. We have free nitrogen, we have free fertility, free sources of energy, and a number of things like that. And the way forward, we believe, is mimicking nature in order to tap into those. These are the principles that we use. These are basically taken from regenerative agriculture in general, although we've adapted them slightly for what we're doing here. And these are common throughout the world now, people practicing regenerative agriculture. First one is to keep the soil covered throughout the year with living vegetation or residue. And a lot of talk about that, just finished with. Minimize soil disturbance, which is generally in the form of tillage. Encourage diversity of plants, insects, soil biology, etc. And in particular, we're looking at how we encourage native diversity of life. Have living roots in the ground as much of the year as possible, living roots plants, which we have an unfair advantage of in California with basically a year-round growing season. Fifth one is integrate well-managed livestock. I'll be talking a lot about that. And 6 is avoid chemical synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and mimic nature for creating your fertility. And the last one is work with people who are dedicated to the principles and practices of growing ecosystem health. If you try and work with somebody who doesn't believe in that, then it's really a time burner. So we try and select and work with people who really believe this is possible. The main principle that we're looking at is how do we take advantage of solar energy? And because really most of our agriculture now almost ignores the potential of solar energy, and that's our greatest energy source. And by that, I mean directly from the sun to the plants through photosynthesis, converting that energy into sugars and carbon that gets pumped down into the soils, which in turn stimulates microbes and which increases the soil fertility. So you basically have this energy cycle occurring. If you have bare ground, that can't happen. It's what is referred to as a solar spill. You've lost all the potential there. So really the main driver in all of this, and this is the main driver in life, in terrestrial life on the planet, is photosynthesis. And so how do we take advantage of that? I'm going to show a few examples of what's going on out there. Nothing will probably be new to anybody in this group. But if we think of this as like a solar panel, we're capturing almost nothing there. The problem is that when we do capture it, whether it's in conventional or organic systems, we tend to till that into the ground. After tilling a cover crop into the soil, we lose most of the carbon within a week. This is another example of probably an organic system, maybe a biodynamic system. Got a lot going for it here, but the ground is still being tilled. So from this perspective of carbon cycling, we're losing a lot of the potential there. In addition, we're also losing beneficial habitat for microorganisms. As another thing Dr. Jones mentioned yesterday was just the effect on soil temperature. The soil temperature on bare ground is a lot higher than on covered ground. And if you're a microbe, that protection is going to be really valuable. So what we're basically looking at working away from is the fossil fuel, monoculture, high input, and high tillage systems, which can occur in both organic conventional practices. And we want to get back, move more towards the solar system that is based off of sunlight and creative planning. I'm going to go through some of the ways in which we do that. I just mentioned the bare soil problem. And one of the big issues, especially for us here, we average 12 inches of rain. We're going to be lucky if we get 4 inches this year, is having the capacity to retain all the water that we do get. This is back to the idea of taking advantage of free resources. Rainfall is lost if we have bare ground and it runs off or just evaporates back into the air. So a thing of primary importance for us is to sequester carbon and create a soil carbon sponge right below the surface. With every 1% increase in organic matter, you get somewhere between 18 and 24,000 gallons increase in water holding capacity. We've increased our water holding capacity probably by about 30,000 gallons per acre, somewhere around there based off of our soil organic matter increase. And that increase came before we even got a crop. So the water is captured in the soil carbon and released slowly into the groundwater, whereas the other water cycle with bare ground, you're just losing most of that. The other thing I want to talk about are free nutrients. And this is something that I've learned from Dr. Christine Jones in Australia. And that is basically, we did a test here looking at total, it's a total nutrient test. And this shows basically how what the level of nutrients are in your soil, not just what is available to a plant as determined by a lab. And the key to this is that the soil microbes can make a lot of this available. So if we have this pool of nutrients in our soil, how do we make that available and take advantage of that? And it really makes it apparent how crazy it is for a lot of the fertilizer inputs. And so this is based off of getting 5 tons of yield, how much we would be pulling off of our soils. This is the level that we have in pounds per acre of these various nutrients. And this is the year's supply that we would have of these. And these are some pretty astounding numbers, and I think it's really important for us to pay attention to this. The idea is not to mine all these, even if it takes 100,000 years or whatever. But right now we have a huge problem in that we don't cycle nutrients. We don't cycle all of our human waste. So this gives us a little time to figure this out, but we really need to work on this. This is another indication of that timeline. We've got 2,500 years of nitrogen, close to 3,000 of potassium, over 3,000 on phosphorus, calcium 15,000, copper 35,000. So it's just really amazing when you look at, and this is in, I believe this is in the top, a little over the top 2 feet of your soil. So those are phenomenal. We have phenomenal pools of resources underneath us. And the key to taking advantage of these is our microbes. And I think that the talk after mine is going to be discussing some of those microbes. Again, here's some others of those nutrients. Looks like we don't have to worry about iron for a long time. One of the ways that we, again, build ecosystem health and mimic nature is by looking at how nature functions. And one of the ways that nature builds and cycles soils is through grazing animals. And in general, they're managed very differently than humans tend to in their native setting. They tend to be in large herds, they move frequently, and they don't return into an area until after it's recovered because they're fouling it, they're dunging and urinating, so they don't want to come back for a while. This is one of the ways that the Great Plains became one of the most fertile regions in the world. And that is also one of the first things that was removed when the first white settlers came into Americas. So we take advantage of this by using livestock, and vineyards and sheep are one of the prime forms of livestock that we've found to be beneficial. And then we're using human creativity. We're looking at not just current methods, but what people have been doing in the past, what indigenous people have been doing, what farmers were doing before they had fossil fuel and chemicals and things like that. So there's a background of knowledge in this realm. One of the reasons to look at incorporating livestock is the effect that they do have on soil. And this is a great study that was done by the NRCS. It was either in North or South Dakota. There's a video on YouTube of this study where they took soil core samples. So they used a device that is able to go into the soil. It pulls out a core of soil, and then they laid it out on a sheet to see what the texture looked like. These were all taken from 200 feet of each other. It's the same soil type, just under different management. The first one on the left there is well-managed grassland, which means they're basically mimicking the way bison used to graze on those prairies, but they were using cattle. So the cattle were grazing in a high density group that was there for a short period of time. The grass and the soils were allowed to recover before coming back on. Probably only 50% or more of the grass was taken during any one grazing. The next slide shows, again, the same soil with season-long grazing. So the cattle were probably put in there in smaller numbers, but they were left there throughout the year. And the last one, had just been converted the year before into a no-till system. And so it was probably sprayed with an herbicide and then planted into, I imagine, either corn or soybeans. You can see the soil structure is really different between those. And even poor management with livestock with the season-long grazing still has better soil structure than the converted cropland. So I was thinking in that regards to how we manage most of our vineyards, and it's basically like that converted cropland, except that we are doing tillage in there. The interesting thing they did after this is they did a water infiltration test for that converted cropland. It took the equivalent of 1 inch of water, what would be the equivalent of 1 inch of rainwater, 31 minutes to infiltrate. So if you had a rain that lasted 15 minutes, half of that would flow off of a rainfall event of 1 inch. On the continuous season long grazing, it took 7.3 minutes for that water to infiltrate. On the well-managed grassland, it took 10 seconds. When I ask myself, what soil do I want? What type of water infiltration do I want? What habitat for microorganisms do I want? What system is going to build carbon better? Because there's a relationship, a positive relationship between water retention and carbon development in soils, then it's obviously going to be by having well-managed livestock and that. The question then is, how do we do that in our vineyards? This is a photo from Gabe Brown, who's a pretty famous regenerative agriculture person. He's been at this for a while. This is a timeline of the various practices that he's done, from no-till to increasing crop diversity, to using cover crops, and then ultimately to going into multi-species cover crops, and then finally into grazing. And his soil organic matter really just shot up once he started combining both the multi-species grazing and the multi-species cover crops and the grazing. Actually, there is something called multi-species grazing, and I think actually Gabe is starting to do that now as well. So here's our problem in vineyards. I've worked in vineyards and designed vineyards in both California and Mediterranean climates, or other Mediterranean climates, and in the Southwest. The first two vineyards I designed, and the first vineyard I managed was in Arizona. We have the same problem in both places. Basically, the kind of brown box is denoting when we need to keep sheep out of vineyards because they graze the vines. The blue curve is denoting the growing season of the grapevines, so that's when we need to keep them out. And then the green hump is showing the growing seasons. And it's kind of similar in both areas, in that we miss the opportunity to take most of that energy and cycle it back into the soils because we have to keep the sheep out of the vineyard. So the question for me became then, how do we make this happen in vineyards? I did a trial in the Alexander Valley, setting up a simple offset system that's electrified, that would enable sheep to graze in the vineyard at any time of the year by keeping that wire electrified and positioning it right below the fruiting zone. This trial was conducted, it was a small plot right next to it was taken out of a 60-acre vineyard. And the other side was managed conventionally. I'd been managing the controlled site organically and biodynamically for a couple of years, just using sheep during the dormant season of the vines, and introduced the sheep. And so here's a few things that they do. For one thing, we never had to mow, we never had to weed eat, we never had to do any undervine cultivation. The control site, you can see there, the suckers are pretty big. There's a number of weeds and things growing in there. Those weeds, by the way, are perpetuated by tillage. Most weeds are they are low successional plants that take advantage of disturbed soil. In the trial site, the sheep took care of all the weeds. Generally, when you put sheep in a vineyard, the first thing they will eat are the weeds, what we consider weeds. The great thing about having them eat the suckers is grazing animals do impart disease and pest resistance to the plants that they browse off of or graze off of. So I actually want sheep in contact with the vines just at those points where it's beneficial to us and doesn't damage the fruit or the growing conditions of the vine. We went kind of late into the season, and we deprived the sheep of feed, and we're able to see that even turning the system off for a few days, they respected it. So it's pretty easy to train sheep to systems like this. When I talk about grazing, proper grazing, what I'm referring to is this idea of again, mimicking nature. And most of this work has come from two people. One is Andrew Voisin, who's a French scientist, and the other is Alan Savory, who has updated Voisin's work and taken it all over the world. This picture would be looking at a vineyard overhead. And on the left side is the way that, that I like to graze vineyards. And on the right side is the way that a lot of well, especially rangeland is grazed. Most people do a pretty good job of grazing vineyards because they understand this concept. And that is, those little brown dots are supposed to be sheep as opposed to sheep turds. And the idea is that you keep them bunched together, you graze them fairly quickly, and then you move them onto the area that's been rested so that that has recovered and the grass is tall again, the grass or the forbs, and they graze that down again. That concentrates the dung and especially the urine. The urine is the most nutrient-rich part of what comes out of an animal. And so if you scatter the animals, you tend to have both overgrazing and compaction and overrest on the same land, and you don't get the utilization that you do by keeping them grouped tightly. You also get more productivity and you get more carbon sequestration out of using proper grazing. This is an example of improper grazing. This is from Sonoma County, and they had some baby doll sheep in here. They left them in this area throughout the season, and they grazed things down to the ground. Just outside of this area where there was cover crop that hadn't been grazed, it was up above the vines. And so I'm not sure why this occurred, but there was a big rainfall event after this, and they had a lot of erosion. This is actually a fairly steep hillside. So again, just using animals is not enough. You have to mimic the way that animals properly graze in natural systems. After doing that trial, these are the benefits that we realized. We eliminated the need for all mechanical or hand cultivation, tillage, and because it was organic, we didn't use herbicides, although there are now herbicides available for organic practices. Both between rows and under the vines, we eliminated approximately 10 to 20 tractor passes. Compaction is a huge issue in all of farming, and we're just starting to realize how big an issue it is. And the more tractor passes we can reduce, the better off we're going to be. Eliminated the need for all hand suckering. You can also do that somewhat with machines now. And it converted those suckers into fertilizer. So those suckers are no longer a problem for us, as our weeds are no longer a problem for us. They're a resource. So we're taking advantage of that solar energy collected into those plants or plant parts and using that to enhance the fertility. We got a reduction in irrigation use, 80% over the organic practices that we were using in the previous years, and 90% compared to the conventional control site. We also got an increase in the average yield by about 1,200 pounds per acre. And according to the winemaker, the quality was had improved as well. So we reduced the need to haul in outside sources of fertilizer and other elements into the vineyard, compost and things like that. Cost savings averaged then $450 to $500 an acre a year. That was in 2011. At that time, I think someone had asked what the cost savings were of sheep. At that time, I did presentations in Australia and did the numbers for here too. And in both Australia, New Zealand, and here, we're averaging about $100 per acre in savings doing dormant season grazing of vineyards. So getting your grazing into the growing season of the vines increases the economic benefits considerably.
Kelly, you have 4 minutes left.
Okay, the first commercial vineyard to adopt the system was in Australia. What we're doing now is an overhead system, and I'm going to skip how we developed that, but basically we used livestock and increasing and over a period of several years, dramatically increase the carrying capacity of that land. This was the final year before planting. We have developed a system now that allows us to graze sheep throughout the year without having to use the electrified deterrent system. It's an overhead system. We've gotten increases in our soil organic carbon that have been fairly substantial based on work that we've been doing and that UC Davis has done and Point Blue Conservation. So just about every place we're testing, the carbon is going up, and sometimes significantly. We're also getting increases in nutrients that we've not added through fertilizer. They're just going up, which means that we're increasing our microbial community. And that's just basically showing that organic matter is going up, so sodium is going down, salinity is going down. One thing we haven't dealt with is, or are having trouble dealing with, is the boron is increasing because we have high boron in our irrigation water. This is what it looks like grazing during the growing season. We had some rams in there for the first time last year. The first thing they eat are the weeds. You can see this bare spot in front and behind the quad there. We didn't graze the area in between because we had some small vines, so we didn't want them to mess with those. They do a great job. And our system is, we have access both ways because it's overhead. You can drive a quad under there. We've increased our biodiversity considerably, and including things like snakes, and keeping the ground covered throughout the year. And this is the last time we grazed in the fall. And so having the system allows us to graze at any time of the year. And this year will be the first year we're able to do that through a significant portion of the vineyard because the vines will be tall enough. From that new design, these are the takeaways that we expect. We'll again replace the need for any hand, machine, chemical, weeding, suckering. We've eliminated, we've never done any tillage except at the initial development. We won't have to do any mowing. We'll reduce the need for offsite fertility. In fact, we will probably need to be careful about building fertility too much, and continue to increase the holding capacity of our soils, water holding, and maintain resilience to climate change. Increase our diversity and increase our profitability because sheep are also a profit center for us. With that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was a very interesting perspective on how agricultural systems can benefit from mimicking natural ecosystems. Up next, we're going to have Anya assist us with the Q&A. And right after that, we're going to have a 10-minute break. So please stay with us. Anya, can you please take it away?
Absolutely. Thanks for all the great questions here. Kelly, I'm going to start it off with, should be a pretty quick one. Are you able to mechanically harvest at Piscina Ranch with the electrified sheep wire at the cordon?
So we actually don't have electrified wire at the cordon, and we're using a divided high trellis system, which can be machine harvested. I don't know if anybody who's using this system, there's several people in California and in Australia who are using this now. I don't know if any of them have mechanically harvested, but I'm sure that it could be set up so that you could mechanically harvest.
All right. I think you touched a little bit on kind of keeping a close eye on nutrients and added nutrition, but do the grazing practices allow you to eliminate the need for compost, or is it just a reduced application?
Yeah, we use compost initially, and after that, we will not be using any compost. So we used 4 tons per acre after we had cleared the land for farming. So that was just to try and jumpstart the fact that we had cleared the land. So our intention is that we will not need any compost.
Great. And how do you contain the sheep to the grazing zone you're targeting? And I guess as an add-on to that, how do you do the sheep ever get out of the fenced area?
To answer the first question or the second question first, yes, they occasionally do get out, but it's actually not that big of a problem for us because they're in a much, the 25-acre vineyard is in a larger 200-acre paddock that is fenced. We use 2 wires, 2 electric wires, a poly wire. Very easy to set up and take down. We also custom graze Clara Vineyard, which is a neighbor of ours, and so we do the same thing there. That's just grazed during the dormant season. So two poly wire solar charger.
Great. And a question about the grape yield increase you mentioned. So could you please clarify the increase of yield by 1,200 pounds per acre? How many annual grazing season passes were required before you saw the response in the vines? And was this vineyard where the grazing was done during dormant season or during the growing season as well?
Okay, for the trial that was done in the Alexander Valley, that increase in yield occurred after the first year of doing extended season grazing. So we grazed from probably the end of January until the end of June. And again, that was grazed periodically. So there weren't sheep in every paddock the whole time. They were bunched up and moved through there. So that increase in yield occurred that first year that we had the sheep in there. And that was surprising, as was the decrease in water use. So.
All right. And how about, could you speak more to the stocking rates per acre and how long the sheep are in that area, or is it variable?
Yep, it is variable depending on the year, and how much, which dictates how much forage is growing in your cover crop. But I would say a general ballpark figure that I use is about 200 sheep per acre. And they may be in there for anywhere from 1 to up to 6 days, depending on how much forage.
Okay. And let's see, speaking of forage, do you have to supplement feed for the sheep, or do they sustain themselves on whatever's growing?
Ironically, sometimes when the feed is growing best, we do have to supplement them with dry feed. We might have to throw a little dry straw in there or something. Otherwise, they're just getting too much green matter, and they need a little bit of dry matter. If they don't get that, sometimes they'll start chewing on the vines a little bit. So,
interesting. And let's see. I'm sorry if I missed this one you mentioned, but what do you have growing under the vines and between the rows? Can you touch a little bit on the cover that you have?
Yep, we've been using a cover crop of oats, triticale, barley, Lana vetch, crimson clover, California poppy, phacelia, daikon radish, and increasingly we are moving towards less of those types of cover crops and more native plants. So we're starting to plant more of the native, especially pollinator plants that are growing around here, in order to increase insect diversity and benefits to the insect population. So one of the things we're worried about, if continuing with the cover crops that we have been using, is again that idea of getting too much productivity.
All right, and let's see, I've got another question. So 200 sheep sounds like a lot to manage. Can you do it with less, or how few is the lower range of that?
No, you could do it with 1 sheep. It depends on your size. You get the vineyard that we're grazing is 25 acres, and so we have the ability, if we wanted to put 1,000 sheep in there. Obviously, it's the amount of sheep relates to how long they're there. And if you have less sheep and you're in a larger area, then you're going to have to stay there for a little bit longer, in which case you're getting compaction and possibly overgrazing. So it's a kind of a mathematical formula between time and amount of forage and number of sheep. And if anybody is interested in learning more about that, I suggest they read Alan Savory, or there's a number of books on planned grazing out now that are helpful in learning those formulations.
All right, maybe you could throw in some suggested reading into our chat window for folks.
Okay.
So you had mentioned, you highlighted that picture of the baby doll sheep that kind of created a little bit too much activity in the Sonoma vineyard. Are there ever instances where those sheep would work year round, or is year round just not a great idea because of the impacts?
Right. So I refer to it as extended season grazing in vineyards, which means that you can take the planned grazing where you keep them bunched up and move frequently, you just extend that out into the growing season of the vines, as long as you have something to eat. What you don't want to do is have a small or a large group of animals in a vineyard. And for instance, you could supplement feed them if you don't have enough feed in there. You're going to be creating compaction and probably high nitrogen levels, and probably not very happy sheep and bare ground. So so really what you want to do, no matter what quantity of animals you have, is keep them moving and allow both soils and plants to rest. And usually a minimum recovery period is about 30 days. And that's during fast growth.
All right, and I think we probably only have a chance for 1 or 2 questions. Circling back to the grape yields, we have another question of what is the grape yield on average for mature vineyards at Piscines under these practices? Curious about the short-term profitability of the system, understanding that the system has a much longer profitability viewpoint at the end, which at the end of the day is important.
So that's a great question, and I wish I had the answer to that, but this will be our first year of a commercial crop at Piscinas. So we will have a better idea going forward after this year what our yield is. Our spacing is 12 by 6, but our training system increases the productivity per vine than over like a conventional VSP. So according to the consultant who's been working with us on this, he is expecting we should get about 5 tons to the acre.
Great, thank you. And maybe, let's see if we can squeeze in 2 more. How do you approach sulfur spray passes when you have sheep in the vineyard?
You have to plan around that. So if you don't have a place to move the sheep out when you're doing a spray, then you shouldn't have sheep in there. But we are going to try and transition to a completely biological approach to powdery mildew this year. We'll see how that works. Previously, we have been using sulfur and oil and serenade, a few things like that. And so we have plenty of room to move the sheep out when we're spraying, and we'll leave them out for a while then, and then put them back after that.
Okay. All right, and one last one. Is there a difference in sheep versus goat grazing in vineyards?
Very different. Goats look up to graze. Sheep kind of look across, and cattle look down. So when a goat grazes, it wants to eat leaves off of trees or bushes and things like that. So goats, I would be really careful with goats. Maybe Nigerian dwarf or something like that might work, but sheep will browse the grapevines, but a goat will definitely take it down. So goats I would be very careful with, and I personally think sheep are really ideal, and especially hair sheep to graze and browse in the vineyard.
All right, well, I think that, that about cuts us out of our Q&A. So I will pass it back to Miguel to close us out for our break. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya. Thank you so much, Kelly. We appreciate it. Up next, we're going to have a 10-minute break. We're going to come back at 10:20. And when we come back, we're going to hear from Dr. Christina Lascano about the members of the soil biome and their contribution to healthy vineyard soils. And after that, we're going to have a panel of growers talking about the economics and marketing of sustainable farming. Please stay tuned. All right, welcome back. Up next, we're going to have Dr. Christina Lascano from UC Davis. Her presentation title is Members of the Soil Biome and Their Contribution to Healthy Vineyard Soils. She is a soil biologist and assistant professor of soil ecology at the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources at UC Davis. She completed her PhD at the Soil Ecology Research Group from the University of Vigo in Spain. Afterwards, she worked as a postdoctoral scholar at the Technical University of Denmark, the University of Calgary, and UC Davis. Before joining the faculty at UC Davis in 2019, Dr. Lazcano was an assistant professor of soil ecology at the California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. At the most basic level, the research of Dr. Lazcano aims to identify the soil ecological interactions responsible for nutrient availability and retention in soils and how they can be managed to increase soil health and sustainability of soil health and sustainability of agricultural production. Dr. Lazcano has worked with different crops like corn, tomatoes, strawberries, and for the last 5 years, Dr. Lazcano's research is focused on wine grapes. Through on-farm collaboration research, Dr. Lazcano hopes to help wine grape producers understand how to improve soil health and carbon sequestration while producing high-quality grapes. Thank you so much, Dr. Lazcano. Take it away.
Thank you, Miguel, for the nice introduction, and thank you to the North Coast Soil Hub for inviting me to speak here. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
We can, but it's not on. There you go. Now it's good to go.
Perfect. So as Miguel mentioned, I am a soil biologist, so I study the living component of soil and how it supports ecosystem services. So today in my presentation, I'm going to be focusing on that, on the soil biome and how it contributes to the health of soils and specifically in vineyards. For the most part of history, we knew as soils as inert media to support the growth of plants and maybe providing minerals and water, but that's it. So we had a rather simplified view of soils, and we knew a lot about the chemistry and the physics of soils, but very little about the biology of soils. And the reason for this is that soils are really hard to study. And it's not that you can just dig a hole and stick your head down and like start observing soil organisms, right? Soil biota, most of it is microscopic, so it's really difficult to observe with the naked eye. And soils are also complex, right? They're heterogeneous. And so for most of the history, we didn't have the right tools to study soil biota. Luckily, over the last decades, and thanks to the development of microscopy techniques, but also molecular techniques like the DNA analysis, now we are starting to understand the large majority, or the large diversity that lives in soils. And we know now that soils are amongst the most diverse ecosystems on Earth, and every life kingdom that we know, it's found in soils, from prokaryotes like bacteria and archaea, which are microorganisms, to eukaryotes, which include microorganisms like fungi, but also animals and plants. And even most important to understanding the diversity that lives in the soil and who is there, it is understanding what are they doing and how are they supporting the ecosystem services that we receive from soils. And so one of the most interesting things is that soil organisms are not in isolation. They're always in constant interaction with each other and with their physical environment. And one of the most common interactions that we find in soils and in other ecosystems is that we call trophic interactions that happen in food webs. Trophic interactions in food webs involve organisms feeding on each other. And here in this slide, we have an example of what it's a simplified soil food web, showing the first trophic level, which are the plants and the organic matter that supply energy to the next trophic level, which are the decomposers, which supply energy to the third trophic level, which are microbial grazers and predators. And then there is higher trophic levels, which are usually predators that feed on the lower trophic levels. In this way, by feeding on each other, soil organisms are regulating the transfer of energy and matter through the soil, through the whole ecosystem. So the energy that is fixed by the plants, the energy of the sun that is fixed by the plants is transformed into organic matter, transferred to the second trophic level, and then the third and the fourth, and then the fifth. And so these interactions are what is supporting the ecosystem processes that are happening in soils. Examples of those ecosystem processes that are supported by soil ecological interactions are the cycling of nutrients, decomposition of organic matter, photosynthesis and plant growth, and even the formation of soil, the mineralization processes, the formation of structure and aggregates in the soil. And all of those are the pillars and the basis for the ecosystem services that we receive. Examples of those that are relevant for agriculture are provisioning services like the production of food, fuel, and fiber, but also regulating services such as the sequestration of carbon, the regulation of the climate in the long term, the composition of waste materials, purification of water, pest and disease regulation, and supporting the conservation of biodiversity. So these ecosystem services are actually perfectly overlapping what we expect of healthy soils. Here in this slide, you have a summary of the basic properties of a healthy soil. So a healthy soil supports the yield of crops, but also the quality of the crops. It supports diversity of soil organisms, microbial activity. It supports climate regulation by storing carbon and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It retains and recycles nutrients. It stores water, and it also facilitates infiltration and drainage. So the concept of soil health integrates the concept of the soil ecosystem, right? The concept of soil health relies on the living component of soil. And this is a very revolutionary idea, which as compared, it involves more complexity than the traditional concept of soil quality that has been used for most of the history, right? Soil health really emphasizes the processes that are supported by the living component of soil. Whereas the concept of soil quality, it's more like a static picture in time of a specific set of properties that are good for a purpose, like producing crops. Like for example, the amount of nutrients in the soil at a specific time, or the texture of a soil. Soil health, on the other hand, emphasizes more the capacity of the soil to provide those nutrients, to withstand stress, for example, and retain water. So those are processes that are supported by soil biota. How does this translate to wine grape production? Well, the wine grape industry has recognized the role of soils in the importance of soils in wine quality, right, for a long time. And it's perhaps one of the commodities that understands the importance of soils the best. And this is what it's incorporated into this concept of terroir, right? The effects of the soil in combination with the climate, the topography, and the grape variety in the quality of the wine, right? However, the concept of terroir is not exactly the same as the concept of soil health. And I'm going to explain that in this slide. So what it's the properties of the soil that are usually contemplated or considered when we talk about terroir, it's mostly properties that are inherent to the soil, like the depth, the types of minerals, the cation exchange capacity, texture, other properties like structure, infiltration, nitrogen supply that might be modified with management as well, right? The concept of soil health incorporates similar parameters, but it also incorporates new things, like, for example, soil organic carbon, microbial activity and biomass, biodiversity, active carbon, or aggregate stability. And those are things or parameters that haven't been taken into account before in the context of wine grape production. So we need to start thinking whether we need to include new soil properties into the concept of terroir, expanding the concept of terroir. And also, if by managing soils to increase soil health, we are actually allowing for a full expression of what is known as the terroir, right? More of the local properties of soils and more of the inherent properties of soils, like the mineralogy, right, or the texture. When we think about novel properties into the concept of terroir, one of the things that is being there's a lot of conversation about recently, and there's a lot of interest, it's understanding the role of the microbiome in wine grape production. The microbiome is fundamental in several ecosystem processes in soil. For example, cycling nutrients, soil microorganisms, control diseases, they sequester carbon. They are directly responsible for the stabilization of carbon in soils. And as we know, they are contributing as well to wine fermentation. So there is research that is showing that microorganisms can be transferred from the soil into the grapes, and that can have an effect all the way into the quality of the wine. And so people is starting to talk about this concept of microbial terroir. But the reality is that we don't know a lot of what are the drivers of the soil microbiome. Can we manage the soil microbiome by using a certain set of practices, right? By adding compost or cover crops. And how much am I going to shift the microbiome with those practices for a given type of soil, right? What is more important in driving the microbiome, a specific soil texture or a specific soil management practice? So those are questions that we still need to answer. When we talk about the soil microbiome, we are really talking about all of the microorganisms that live in the soil. And that includes things like viruses, archaea, bacteria, fungi, protists, and other microbial eukaryotes, like, for example, algae. So the microbiome is this big box that pretty much includes everything that is microscopic in soils, that is smaller than 8 micrometers. So you will need a microscope to study it, right? Most of the tests that are right now being offered by commercial labs are only focusing on 3 of those microorganisms, which are bacteria, archaea, and fungi. So we are only looking at a small portion of the microbiome, and there's way more that we can look at. For example, we are starting to understand the role of viruses in soils, and there is some research that shows that viruses could be really important in the carbon cycle and in sequestering carbon, because viruses actually regulate bacterial and fungal populations in the soil, which are responsible for carbon sequestration, right? So this is a fascinating field of study that is advancing really quick. And the interesting thing is that it could have very direct applications not just for soil health, but also for agricultural production. So when we're studying the soil microbiome, there's two questions or two things we can focus on. We can focus on studying the structure of the microbiome, so finding out who is there in the soil, or we can focus on the function. What are they doing, right? What is it that those microorganisms are doing in the soil? If we think about structure, there are different things that we can measure. And those measurements are usually, they differ in the resolution, amount of information, and cost, right? So we have things that are they go from very simple and cheap measurements like microbial biomass carbon, which is pretty much just measuring how much carbon is contained in the microorganisms. That's a relatively simple measurement, it's cheap, but it offers very low resolution. We have PLFAs. PLFA stands for phospholipid fatty acids, and those are membrane lipids that are used to, they are biomarkers for different microbial groups. They mark gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, fungi, and mycorrhizal fungi. So they offer a little bit more resolution. They provide more information, but it's also a little bit more expensive. And then on the other range of cost and resolution, we have molecular techniques that use DNA markers. And we have 16S RNA, those are markers for prokaryotes, bacteria, and archaea. And we have ITS biomarkers, and those are markers for fungi. So, and again, the amount of information provided by this analysis is huge. There is like tens of thousands of data points per single soil sample. So we're getting a really good resolution, right? But the cost is also much higher. And sometimes we have to balance whether we need so much information or not. In terms of function, if we want to find out what is it that these microbes are doing, sometimes that is the most important question. Then we can look at different things. And also, again, we have a range from resolution, from lower to more resolution, and also cost. So we can measure microbial activity, and this is a very general measurement that assesses or measures the amount of CO2 that is released from the soil. Right? It's kind of measuring the respiration of microorganisms. We have enzyme activity assays, which are a bit more sophisticated, and they measure the activity of enzymes that are synthesized by microorganisms and that are used in like the breakdown of organic compounds that are either carbon or nitrogen-based organic compounds. So these offer a little bit of more detailed information. It's explaining a bit more of what's happening in the soil, but it's also more expensive. And then again, all the way in the extreme of resolution and cost, we have metagenomics, which involves, again, using DNA techniques and sequencing to study the abundance of genes that are regulating microbial functions in the soil. So we're getting a lot of information that we can use to explain ecological processes, but the amount of information that we're getting, again, might be too much for certain questions. So that's for the microbiome, but as I mentioned, it is really important to study the soil food web as a whole. And the reason for that is that there are organisms like earthworms or nematodes that are grazing and consuming microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. And by doing that, they regulate the abundance of microorganisms in soils and therefore the functions that microbes provide, like the cycling of nutrients, decomposition, and so forth. So it's important to have a general overview of the health, the structure, and the diversity of the food web, in addition to study the soil microbes. So if we want to study the health of the food web, there are different things we can do, right? You can look to see if you have earthworms in your soil, and earthworms are usually good indicators of soil health. Now, if we want to study the whole food web, that is a really complicated task. And it usually requires very specialized taxonomic knowledge of all of the different types of organisms that live in the soil, right? And it's really a too complicated task to do. So what we do is use proxies. Those are organisms that can be used to assess the health of the food web, right? And if you look at this slide and try to find a common denominator across all of the different trophic levels, or at least most of them, one type of organism that can be found in all of the different trophic levels in the food web are nematodes. So nematodes are typically used as proxies of the health, structure, and diversity of the food web, and therefore they can be used as indicators of soil health. Interestingly, we have nematodes that feed directly on plants, and those are the ones that are more famous or infamous because they are the pathogens, right? The herbivores. We have nematodes that feed directly on microorganisms. Those are bacterivores if they feed on bacteria, or fungivores if they feed on fungi. We have nematodes that are omnivores and they would just eat anything. And we have nematodes that are predators. So they would feed other nematodes, for example, right? So nematodes are really good indicators of soil health. They're, as I mentioned, they're represented in all of the trophic levels. We have from herbivores to bacterivores to fungivores, predators, and omnivores. They can be classified into all of these different groups by looking at the morphology of their mouthpieces. And this is an example of a nematode. And the mouthpiece in here, this is an herbivore. It has a stylet. It's like a needle that it uses to inject into the plant roots and suck the juices. And then bacterivores have a different morphology in the mouthpiece, same as nematodes, etc. Another good thing about nematodes is that they're sensitive to disturbance, and they're very well correlated with beneficial functions like the cycling of carbon and nitrogen. And so they are very good for studying ecosystem processes. So what can we do to manage the microbiome and the whole food web? There's different strategies that are well known to support soil health. The three pillars are increasing soil organic matter. And so for that, we can use organic fertilizers, reducing disturbance, and most commonly that is associated to reducing tillage intensity, and increasing and maintaining a living plant cover. And so one of the best examples of practices for that is the use of cover crops. I'm going to, for this presentation, I will be focusing on using organic matter to support soil health. Organic matter, organic fertilizers are direct additions of organic matter to the soil. And so they have a very direct impact on the physical, chemical, and biological aspects of soils and soil health. Organic matter, it's a food source for the soil microbiome and for the food web, so it improves soil biological properties. It supplies nutrients and increases cation exchange capacity of the soil, so it also improves the chemical properties of the soil. And it reduces bulk density, improves aggregation, and so by doing that, it improves the physical properties of the soil. And then finally, organic matter is essential for carbon sequestration and climate regulation, because organic matter, there's an echo. I just heard myself. Okay, I hope it's resolved. Organic matter, it's more than 50% carbon. So putting organic matter into the soil involves putting carbon into the soil, right? So we know very well the benefits of using organic fertilizers for soil health. However, many studies have shown that even though there are benefits, the outcomes and the magnitude of the benefits are actually very variable between different studies, right? And very difficult to predict. And that makes it also very difficult to assess the impacts of these practices on grape quality, which is one of the things that growers are looking at the most.
Christina, you have 5 minutes left, and a friendly reminder to the audience to please type your questions in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna kind of move quick because I still have a few slides to show. So we believe that one of the reasons why we can't assess or predict, one of the sources of uncertainty in these outcomes is the lack of knowledge of the effect of practices in soil biota. And so to assess these, we are right now doing a study in Napa Valley. We know that there is an extreme large variability in the types of soils in Napa, and also in the amount of organic matter that they can accumulate. So this is a project in which we're studying the variability in different soil health indicators and organic matter accumulation across all of these different types of soils. This is a project supported by the American Vineyard Foundation and in collaboration with the Napa Valley Grape Grower Association. And one of the things that we want to study here is knowing that there is so much variability in soils and organic how important is the microbiome in driving soil health, and also what are the most informative indicators, right? Are fungal to bacterial ratios sensitive enough to be good indicators of soil health? Do we need to use molecular techniques for this, right? So these are some of the questions that we're working on right now. And I want to quickly show you a case study that we did to look at the effects of management practices on the soil food web. So in this case, we didn't focus just on the microbiome. Again, we focused on the whole food web using nematodes. And this was a study that was done by the master's student, Holly Denniston-Schitz, down in Edna Valley in San Luis Obispo County. And we wanted to look at the effects of organic fertilizer inputs on soil health using nematodes as proxies. So we had different treatments. This was part of a bigger trial, which also studied the effects of cover crops and weed management. And in terms of fertilizer treatment, what we had is control with no fertilizer, a synthetic fertilizer, and an organic fertilizer, which was dehydrated poultry manure and feather meal, which was applied to the vineyard. And we wanted to compare two locations within the plots. And we looked at the tractor row and the vine row separate because they received very different management. The tractor row usually has a vegetation cover, doesn't receive irrigation, but in the vine usually has the vegetation removed, it receives irrigation and the fertilizer, right? So we expected to see differences, and we actually did. The abundance of nematodes was larger in the tractor row as compared to the vine. There were more nematodes there. And the most interesting thing is that when we went to look at the types of nematodes that we had in each location, they were completely different. So we found that under the vine, you can see this in this pie chart, the majority of the nematodes that live in the soil under the vines were herbivores, the plant parasites, right? Whereas the tractor row had a more complex and higher diversity of trophic groups, the proportion of herbivores was lower, and there was a higher proportion of fungivores and bacterivores in the tractor row. And that was also associated with indicators of soil health like pH, available nitrogen, and carbon. So we think that the tractor row, because it has continuous cover and it receives a less intense management, has a more balanced food web. We looked at the effects of the fertilizer applied under the vine and how it affects this proportion of nematodes. And what we've seen is that organic fertilizers shift that abundance significantly. So applying organic fertilizers was a good strategy to remediate that imbalance in nematodes. Organic fertilizers increase the abundance of fungivores and bacterivores under the vine as compared to the plant parasitic nematodes. So it was
Cristina, we have 1 more minute, sorry.
Thank you, and I have one more slide, so that's perfect. So using organic fertilizers seemed to be a good strategy to remediate this imbalance in the food web and to increase food web complexity. So overall, we have enough scientific evidence to show that the soil biome is a foundation of soil health, and managing soil organisms is key to managing soil health, but we need more research to understand the complexity and the main drivers of the soil biome. And the goal of this is that at some point we can include soil microbiology and soil biology into precision agriculture strategies. And with this, I am done, I guess right on time. Thank you very much for your attention. And thank you all, the supporters of our research.
Thank you so much, Cristina. This is an amazing perspective on the universe that is growing under our feet. Anya, please take it away with the questions and answers.
All righty.
I'm gonna see if I can start.
Okay, so question number 1. Do you have any field tools you'd recommend for measuring soil microbiology?
Field tools, that is very difficult. There are some field soil health tests that measure respiration that you can use, relatively simple. There are also lab incubation tests that you can get that are very simple to use, that you can use. Actually, just taking a soil sample and incubating it, you don't need a lab. It's called Solvita test, and it has these pads that you put in a jar with soil, and they will change color and indicate how much respiration you have in your soil. So that is a really good and simple method. Yeah. And then in general, there you have the typical indicators like looking at the color of the soil, looking at the structure. If you pick up a handful of soil, you can look at the aggregates. Those like they look like cookie crumbs, and when there's a lot of biology, when the biota is active in the soil, those aggregates are usually rounded. They have round shapes. Right. So if you have earthworms, and now that it's raining, all of the earthworms are kind of becoming active, you'll notice a lot of these, what is called the earthworm casts on the top of the surface of the soil. That's pretty much the feces of the earthworms that are coming up to the surface, right? And those are round. So all of the aggregates that are biogenic, they tend to be rounded. So that's a really good way of looking at it.
All right. Well, if not doing, maybe you could enter into the chat the name of that test that folks can look into. So if not doing stuff in the field, would there be certain labs you would recommend, or how would you assess a commercial lab's ability to test the soil health parameters you've mentioned?
Oh, there are labs that are, we talked about the lab in Oregon State University yesterday, that offers a kind of a comprehensive testing of soil health. I think many commercial labs are starting to offer organic matter tests and things like PLFA assessments and microbial activity. I think more and more commercial labs are starting to offer that type of information. But like in a comprehensive way, if you want to assess soil health in a comprehensive way, and you want to have the whole set of indicators measured, then I think there's only a few labs that can do that, like the one in Oregon State University or Cornell.
All right. Let's see, what are your thoughts on impact on soil microbiology of various irrigation levels, including dry farming?
That's a really good question. And that's something we're also starting to work on. Definitely, the soil microbiome needs water to function. And so there is a trade-off to, in maintaining soil health in that sense, that you need water. You need to spend a little bit of water to keep the soil healthy. Something you can do to balance that out, it's over time building soil health. And for example, in vineyards in the tractor row, keeping the plant cover over the rainy season allows, to capture the rain and keep a plant, protect the soil without using much water during the rainy season. And that boosts soil health. That's what we've seen a lot in vineyards, that the tractor row is actually, it has a great potential to support soil health without the investment in water.
That's very interesting. Okay, how about timing for taking samples? Seems like soil health parameters will vary seasonally and with water content. So is there a better time to take samples?
It does. And for me, I prefer to take samples in spring. So like now, when, the things are not dry yet, there's enough moisture. Now is when things are starting to be active. Then through summer, as things get more and more dry, then microbes, a lot of them go into dormancy, earthworms go into dormancy. So the soil is not as active.
All right, and then a few questions coming in asking about the best way to qualify or measure nematodes that are in the soil, and then also a similar question for fungi and the virus abundance that you mentioned.
Yeah, so the question is regarding methods?
Yes, in terms of what's the best way to measure those different organisms?
Yeah. Nematodes are tricky because they require specialized knowledge. So somebody who knows how to identify them. And we have a lab here at UC Davis that does that kind of analysis. But we are developing molecular techniques that are much quicker now. So hopefully in the future it's gonna be easier. For viruses, it's DNA-based techniques as well. So sequencing of markers, genetic markers and viruses.
And how about fungi? Is there certain tests?
The same, yeah, same. I mean, you can use like microscopic techniques, right, for microorganisms as well. There's certain stains that you can use for microbial cells. Right now, the quicker and best, most reliable is molecular techniques, so DNA-based techniques.
All right, and this might be a slightly bigger question than we have time to really dive into, but could you kind of quickly speak to what the impact on soil health could be from mowing versus tillage in the tractor row?
Yeah, the effects of tillage depend very much on the intensity of tillage and on the soil. And so I will be careful about making a general statement about that. And overall, if you till too much, then you run into the risk of destroying soil structure, right? And that's what you don't want. So there's a certain level of tillage that might be okay. And the truth is that tillage incorporates the cover crop and it accelerates that decomposition and improves the access of that organic matter for microbes, right? So it makes things quicker and easier for microbes. But if you till too much, then you are losing all of the benefits of microorganisms as well in the soil structure, for example. Now, I think there is a balance, and I guess that has to be determined in a case-to-case basis.
All right, well, thank you, Christina. That's all for our question and answer session. And, you know, it sounds like there are still a bunch of questions out there, especially when it comes to the microbial health. And I encourage everyone to stay tuned to the soilhub.org, because that is the reason why we have the field trials we have going, is to try to help answer those questions. All right, and I'll pass it back to Miguel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya. Thank you so much, Christina. Up next, we have a panel of growers talking about the economics and marketing of implementing sustainable practices. This panel is going to be hosted by Katie Bentley from Mendocino RCD. And as part of the panel, we have Paul Dolan from Troy Hearst. We have Ryan Johnston from Ridge RCD and Biotic Beverages, and Julie Johnson from Tres Sabores Vineyard in Napa. Thank you so much. Take it away, Katie.
Great. We're so excited to have all of y'all here. Thanks for sticking around to the last session. But I want to not say too much about you and leave that straight to you. So I'm just going to dive straight in on how about we talk about Ryan first. He's one of our RCD members too, but it is speaking about his other endeavor. So you want to start for us? Oh shoot, you're muted.
You guys hear me now?
Sounds great.
Yes.
Hey everyone, great to be here with you all. Yeah, I'm a conservation planner 1 day a week for the RCD, so I love having a foot in that world, but most of my time is working with my family business, which I'm a co-owner of with my dad and brother. It's called Biotic Brands. We're based in Petaluma, and we're a probiotic beverage producer. So, and there's a lot of wine folks. We're also in the beverage space, and an up and comer in a slightly different aspect of the beverage space. So we produce probiotic beverages, which is an alternative. The ones we make are an alternative to kombucha. What makes them different is that we use sliced carrots and beets to drive our fermentations of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, rather than using refined sugar, which kombucha does. And then we flavor them with cold pressed juices. Next slide. And, you know, the main value proposition of our beverages, of course, is thirst quenching and fun to drink. But, you know, kind of the deeper why is supporting a healthy human microbiome. And this is a fascinating field of study that, you know, obviously connects to the soil microbiome. But, you know, for every 1 cell in the human body, there's 10 cells in the human microbiome. The vast majority of those live in your GI tract. And it's really the home of, you know, many of the things that really make us human. That's where your immune system really resides. That's where you are able to metabolize and access nutrition, of course, but maybe unintuitively as well, that's where a lot of your neurotransmitters are also created, and so on and so forth, which affect your mood and your cognitive ability. Next slide. So said another way, you know, what makes us human, what literally gives a texture to our day-to-day lives, you know, if we have bloat or we have brain fog or we're sick, is actually not human. And we really are trying to bring that narrative forth with our beverages and kind of invite people into this consciousness shift that I think we're working on in kind of all facets of our culture across the planet. And when you kind of sink into the power of the human microbiome, it invites you into this notion that a mentor of mine, Brock Dolan, often says that, you know, we can do all the ecosystem restoration, but if we don't do the ecosystem restoration as well along with it, it's kind of all for naught, right? And so I think marketing, and marketing in its purest form is storytelling and meaning making, really has a huge role to play in this shift afoot. Next slide. And you don't have to follow this thread of interconnection too far from the human microbiome to make your way back to the soil microbiome. And I think that's one of the most exciting things out there. Kind of on one side of the spectrum, I think, you know, we use all certified organic ingredients. There's the sort of less bad side of the spectrum, eliminating things like glyphosate, which wreak havoc on the soil microbiome, then obviously wreak havoc on your gut microbiome as well. That's kind of the less bad side of it. I think the more exciting frontier, where I think we're all excited and kind of looking at that horizon, is the potential in healthy soils to actually create more nutrient dense food and also address climate change, of course. And so we can only do so much in terms of delivering quality within our operation if we don't go the next step up. And we're not actually growers ourselves, but if we don't work within our supply web, as so many of the grape growers know here, that's really where the quality is made first and foremost. So we're excited to start doing that work. Next slide. And so just to talk briefly about some of the facets of our environmental work and our soil health work. First and foremost, kind of fundamentally in our business, we decided to use carrots and beets to drive our fermentations rather than we sit in the kombucha case, and we're an alternative to kombucha. Kombucha is made with refined sugar and tea, which comes from far-flung corners of the planet. Our supply web is 90% in California, and all of our carrots and beets are sourced within California. So that alone, is pretty fundamental to what we do. Up in the upper right, we made the change from sourcing all of our packaging overseas in 2019, and so that's all domestically sourced as well now. Thanks to Sonoma Clean Power, all of our manufacturing is run by 100% renewable energy. Down in the lower left are the good folks over at Terra Firma Farms and Winters, and so we are now of a scale where we're excited to start working up the supply web and working with producers directly to source directly from farms, going beyond organic practices to use healthy soils practices. And initially, like working with these guys and the turmeric farm we work with over in Hawaii, the quality is just so much better as well. And so we're really excited about that. And the next step that we're looking at is figuring out that same direct sourcing for our carrots. And in addition to working with farms that are using regenerative farming practices, also looking for farms that have diverse farm ownership as well as a way to put more of those dollars back in their pockets and support this work rolling forward. And then the last bit I'll mention in the upper left-hand corner is Sarah at Green Star Farm. So all of the byproduct coming out of our beverage production as well flows right back into healthy soils. It's actually upcycled into really high quality animal feed for this amazing pastured operation as well. And so we're providing high fiber and high probiotic feed for her operation. And that just kind of is a non-cash way that we can support the good work of other producers in our community who are supporting healthy soils. So contact information there. And if you want to follow us on Instagram, check out our website. But that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Ryan. That was a great overview. I'm going to jump to Paul now. Could you give us maybe about 5-minute overview of your business and how soil health plays into that?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, Julie. It's been a long time. Katie, nice to see you. And Ryan, yes, great. Good, nice presentation. Congratulations for what you're doing. I just some sort of brief comments, just sort of personal comments. So, I've been involved in this conversation around regenerative, sustainable, organic, biodynamic for a really long time. And, my personal commitment for the longest time is to help generate this conversation and so that we can start to create the shift that we need to create. And so thank you guys for doing what you're doing, because every time, we talk about it, every time we share it, it makes a difference. And clearly, the nature of this conversation today is quite different than it would have been 10 years ago. I mean, the healthy soil concept wasn't even, we didn't talk healthy soils. We talked other things, but sustainability 20 years ago was a brand new word relative to the way we were using it. And so the nature of this conversation is really coming to life. Actually, I like to say that the new farming methods going forward, whether it's organic or biodynamic, or what I'm involved now is with regenerative organic, is really all farming in service of life. And so, and you can look at that from every metaphor you want, but until we start orienting ourselves with that simple orientation, we won't bring back the health of the planet. It's really that simple. So thanks for the slide. This is my home ranch up in Mendocino. So if you guys just want to roll through the slides, I'm not going to speak about the slides individually, but I kind of look at this as a holistic property that has lots of diversity, whether it's beneath the soil or above the soil. So I thought my comments would be both about my farming business as well as wine businesses that I've been involved in, and kind of telling maybe a little bit of the story or some of the mindset that we had in making some of the engaging the way we did and sharing it the way we did in order to build not only the brand, but it's also that communication vehicle to really share what was important, whether it was for our guests now. We're the little wine company I'm involved with now is a D2C business. So people come to the property and they join the wine club, and so we communicate with them in a number of different ways, whether it's through newsletters or in the types of products that we sell them, and the way we just engage in our storytelling. But it's not much different from a vineyard standpoint. I know there's a lot of people on this call that are farmers that are looking at this new paradigm, if you will, of healthy farming, healthy soils. But I also share this with, so I have a great business. We have about 300 acres in Mendocino. And so I speak to our buyers. I speak to the winemakers. I invite the winemakers out. I mean, we take them on tours. We talked about, equipment and nature of soil and just how we've oriented ourselves to the property and what we think is important from the standpoint of quality. And I think we always have to keep that in mind, that one of the reasons we're doing this is to make better, healthier products. And yeah, there's fun stories involved, and I think the more fun you can make the stories, the more interesting it is to the listeners. Whether it's the distributor, I had a whole program of creating a biodynamic camp where I had hundreds of distributor representatives and retailers, and helping them better understand the story I think is really important in order to, once again, one more part of the system, one more avenue to share. So you can tell all these stories about this is compost. I mean, we bring our waste materials from our wineries. My son and I also have a larger facility that we process for other people, and we bring all of that pumice, and we bring in dairy manure from local organic dairies, and we mix that and prepare that and put that back into our vineyards. And each picture has a little story. I'm involved with another organization that's creating a what do we call it? Songbird trail from Baja to BC. And so the idea is to build out this whole possibility of having bird boxes, whether they're raptor perches or owl boxes, or these bluebird boxes that are occupied by all kinds of birds, so that we can start to help people's imagination, whether it's our neighbors that have gardens, or neighbors that are vineyards, or neighbors that are some other type of other type of activity. We happen to be on a creek, so we're able to tell the story of the creek. We did a huge creek restoration a few years ago in partnership with the Sonoma Water. And so the idea was to build a habitat for spawning, because we know that the spawning has been significantly reduced over time, just because of the nature of development, if you will. And so we've done sort of significant damage to these waterways, and this was a way to explore as to how you could bring that back. And then people sit on these on the banks here, and so they're immersed in the story, they're immersed in the beauty, they're immersed in the possibility of what we can generate and recreate.
That's great. Thanks, Paul, for introducing us to all of that. I'll turn it over to Julie and leave it pretty open-ended for you on how you want to introduce your business and how soil health is related.
Nope, you're on mute, Julie.
I'm sorry, I was being a good citizen there. Hi, everybody, and thank you. Hey, Paul, I was trying to look over in my bookcase here. Your book is right there someplace. Great inspiration for a very long time for me on a personal level too. And I think that's what everybody is talking about here, is that kind of personal engagement. It's very infectious. It's very conducive to sharing and to engaging people, I think. And I think, Paul, you've done that a lot. A shout out to Miguel and the RCD for continuing to push farmers in a direction, in my case, towards actually not even talking about sequestering carbon, but evaluating what I'm actually doing. So there's one thing in being a small, very small farmer that I think is important, and that's setting out some goals. But another thing is actually measuring what you're doing. So you have goals, you have questions, and then you come to a point where, as we've just heard from the last presenter, it's a challenge, especially in organics, to get the information that we need, but continuing to push that story and continuing to push the information, the acquisition of information, important information, not just anecdotal information, for people, I think really makes a difference. I also want to talk back and give a nod to Kelly and to the whole Alan Savory Institute. That his contribution, I don't think can be underplayed. I mean, it's just played a tremendous idea in the way that I'm working with sheep systems, and I'm actually hoping to get better with my sheep systems now. At Tres Sabores, I've been here in this little vineyard since 1987. It's a vineyard that was planted in 1971. So we're one of now, unfortunately, with all of the replanting to Cabernet here in Rutherford, we're probably one of the oldest vineyard, Zinfandel vineyards now. Since that time, we immediately converted to a CCOF programming. We've brought in animals. We've continued to do compost and cover cropping with an emphasis on changing out the cover crop and planting more species now that it's easier to get organic cover crop seeds, changing those out and going for diversity. Diversity not only in terms of what those seeds do, but when there's flowering and when you're enabled to leave some of the flowers out there for forage for your animals, for predator insects, beneficial insects, as well as for bees. We're also working very closely while working with my son to work on conservation tillage. And so we've brought in we're a dry farm and have been for over 30 years now, which is a challenge right now with the biggest drought since the late 70s, right? But we've been working with the crimping system of late and trying to transition ourselves. I think if I can get better at my sheep systems, that the whole thing really might come together. So the dry farming has tended to work very well here. And we know that now over the last 30 years, we've managed to build we've had core samples taken through the Vincennes program, David Ebert now it was at Purdue, now at Oklahoma State. Vincennes offered us core samples that allowed us to see that we have pretty great engagement vertically in the soil, the depth of where we were able to find worm casings, for example, in some parts of the vineyard now 5 feet deep. So we're doing something there to engage that soil. Hedgerows, I think nobody has really touched on that, but Paul, your slides were beautiful. And hedgerows, I think the question has been posed, what can you do to start on this program? Well, hedgerows for me were one of the easiest things to put in, and specifically for diversity, for forage, for vertical systems, for all sorts of animals and birds to engage with. It's even one little step in that regard. We use pomegranates as an illustration of regenerative farming. We use pomegranates because they're great species in general. They're not quite native, but they've been here for 400 years. They're very adaptive. And we use the pomegranates for everything from vinegar to bee and hummingbird feed, essentially natural feed, all the way through our pomegranate and paella party every year, where we literally draw people in. We have them drink pomegranate margaritas, and that helps, but we draw people in, and it's like an active engagement. Taste the various pomegranates, see what we do with it. Know that the pomegranate material goes back in to create the manure that we use our sheep and chicken systems to use to do compost. So people are brought into that, and I think it's very compelling to have that. It's very persuasive. for people to take one small step. If we engage our guests at the vineyard to go out and be able to pick a pomegranate or taste a pomegranate, it's like encouraging them, especially this time of the year. Go out and share your energy in the vineyard. Bring that energy back. Cycle that energy, because there's a real engagement factor here. And then if people really get interested, then you start pulling the bell beans and showing them the rhizomatic bacteria colonies. And then that just leads you on and on and on to engaging more. We used to have a grower who followed our practices at Frog's Leap, but the famous thing is when we challenged him, and he said, we said, hey, you're almost organic now. Things are really, really working well. The quality of the grapes is improving and so on. And he was like, no goddamn way. But so sometimes people don't want to be engaged with the big O word, but they will see that everything else meets their kind of hearts and minds. So, sometimes it's just engagement is not so much getting people to sign on or to something. It's just really getting them to practice engaging. People come to vineyards like yours, Paul, and it's clear that they feel like they can really step into it. And I think we do ourselves in general a disservice by isolating ourselves with big fancy windows. I think part of the thing is to not only, and this is partly, I think, for what one of my goals is not only to engage my customers, but even more importantly, to engage my employees as to the why and the how across all the systems at the winery. It's not a buy-in question at all. I don't like that kind of term. I don't think it's very effective. I think it's an engagement in a process of persuasion. So if we can show actively in our vineyard what we're doing to ourselves and continuing trying to be better scientists, good scientists all the way along the way, I think that's really, really great. So here at Tres Sabores, the emphasis is producing really good wine and getting people to understand where it comes from. Things have roots. There's a reason, and hopefully you like the wine, and there you are.
Excellent, thank you. Well, you all spoke a bit to engagement and how you're trying to engage your consumer and sometimes even your employees and whoever you're trying to work with. But are there other specific tools or partnerships or strategies that have helped you actually be profitable by featuring these sustainable and environmental practices that you have? Let's just start back again with Ryan.
I'm humbled to be on the panel with both you. We're kind of a newcomer to this space. Julie, you're saying you've been on your vineyard since 1987. I've been on the planet since 1987. So thank you for your leadership in this space. But yeah, I mean, I think we just became a certified B Corp this last year, which is sort of a third-party certification for this that I think carries a lot of value. And for us, it's telling a differentiated story. Like, we're one of the only ones in the kombucha case where we're found in grocery. We don't have the fortune at this point of selling D2C, where we sell pretty much only to retailers. And so those retailers across the West Coast, like, we sit in this case, and I think are really trying to be a beacon for this different way of being. And that to us has been really important. And for us, that usually shows up in the conversation with the buyers. And so, yes, always first and foremost deliver a better product. Like, the product quality always has to be there, but I think what you do to build a long-term relationship is have all of these other co-benefits and the deeper why surrounded in there. I think all humans intrinsically need a sense of purpose and meaning, and I think by embodying these practices, that's a way of sort of embodying it as a brand. And the buyers are looking for it as well. I think they're all aware that this notion of regenerative agriculture or regenerative organic is coming. A lot of them are quite educated on it, but when you come and give them the opportunity to engage in that, that's oftentimes very compelling.
Absolutely. Paul, any specific economic or marketing strategies that you'd like to highlight? Oh shoot, you're muted. Yep.
There you go. Yeah, I was saying I have a whole bunch of stories, but we don't have time for them all. But before I get into that, I just want to make a comment because Cristina I thought was really very inspiring. Of course, Kelly with all the work he's done, and I know there's a lot of farmers on here. One of the inside of the Regenerative Organic Alliance that I'm part of and been part of for some time now, we've done an exploration on soil testing, and this is also for the RCD. So some of the best labs we found are Ward's and Woods End and Cornell. Ward's and Woods End do a soil carbon test using dry combustion, which is probably the best test. Cornell doesn't do that, but Cornell has a beautiful scorecard that they give you for your soil testing. Something that I suppose somebody could use as far as promoting their vineyard and their grapes and the quality of their grapes. And Ryan, thanks for bringing up B Corp. That's been an amazing organization that's really making a big contribution in the world of primarily small business, but Patagonia is a B Corp, so that they're pretty big. So it has far reach. I guess let me see, from a tool standpoint. From a winery standpoint, what we did last year is we partnered with Hotel Healdsburg, and which is just a great partner, and they have a lot of people coming through. They're very environmentally focused, and that's why they picked us out. And what we did is we put together a tour for them. So when we have people come to the property to taste wine, we also offer them a tour. And the tour is you saw some of the property there. So we can talk about all of the different aspects that we engage in relative to the impact that it has on our wines and the quality of our wines. And then of course we can taste the wines and they can see the what I say is the ontological expression of our particular place that comes as a result of the environmental things that we do. We're currently building out a biodynamic story and a biodynamic tour so that they can see the rain tower that captures water, and then it goes down through a flow form, and then we mix the biodynamic preps, and we can show them where we bury the preps and the horns and all of that. Now that's a different kind of story, and I don't always necessarily recommend that, but I've been doing it for a long time. It seems to work okay. I don't think I scared anybody too badly. So that's on the visitor side. On the distributor side, I built out it was a biodynamic camp, and we invited people to come spend time with me for 3 days, and they had camp facilities, and we got up in the morning and made coffee together and collected eggs together, and then started our day walking through the vineyards and talking about starting from the soil and working our way up and talking about all the different impact, and then going into the garden and then observing plants and how plants express themselves, and from the standpoint of the elemental expression, whether it's water, or earth, or fire, and then how we would then therefore engage with those plants relative to food preparation. But then also, how do you read a grapevine? So how do you read a Chardonnay plant different than a Cabernet plant versus a Zinfandel plant? They express themselves differently. They show up differently. They have different needs. And therefore, you would plant them in a particular place or not, on a hillside or down near the water, kind of depending on the plant itself and its elemental sign and its expression. So there's all of those. There's so many ways to capture the imagination of those that you're sharing with, because essentially that's what storytelling is. It's capturing people's imagination. And each property, I know Julie's done an amazing job with her property in Napa, so people know that that's the place that you go in order to get a fuller expression of her relationship with her environment and the importance of that and the expression of the quality of her wines. So the stories work their way around the industry. I mean, Kelly has been telling this story, Mulville, for a long time. So we know about Kelly and all of the different places that he's gone. So he's contributed to the nature of this general conversation. It's still not it's still not, when organic food only represents, I don't know, less than 10% of food, and organic wine is even less than that. Biodynamic wine, so I'm a biodynamic farmer as well, and been involved in Demeter, and I do that. That conversation is a really tiny conversation, but it has a beautiful expression to it. There's a beautiful story behind it that's really, really captures people's imagination. So whether it's about the microbiome and how you tell that story, I've done it in pictures. I've had paintings done in order to be able to express the breadth of that and its relationship inside of the larger system. There's many, many, many ways.
Excellent. Julie, you mentioned a couple earlier, but I'd like to see if you wanted to expand on any. I love the hedgerows and pomegranates example.
Well, and I think part of strengthening all of this is alliance, and what can a really tiny place like mine do, or what can you do if you're one individual in a much larger organization? Well, you can start, but you can also, we've always sort of parlayed associations and affiliations, and a few of mine that I found particularly helpful, RCD, for example, Napa Green, definitely bringing that along. Third-party systems, I think, are important. Wild Farm Alliance, oh man, they're doing some really wonderful things. Or if Vincennes, I mentioned earlier, the Napa growers have been putting on some extraordinary programs as well. I think that there's a lot that you can do to reach out to that on a very wine focused way. I have a basic, our basic tour here always includes like a mint tasting or a tomato tasting as a way of kind of bringing people need reassurance that what they're smelling or what they're tasting or what they're experiencing is okay. It's their perspective. It's a good thing. So we do a few little mini exercises of mint smelling and tasting across three or four varieties, just to kind of get people's senses engaged. And that's always fun. We welcome kids and animals here, other animals. And one of the things that works really well is a scavenger hunt for kids. And kids in a certain age range, but it takes them everything from lessons on green stuff to recycling. So that's kind of fun. So we've been having some success for that. With respect to distributors and in general restaurants, which is where most of our business is or will be, hopefully again soon, I've always been very discouraged by the disconnect between a lot of restaurateurs, meaning chefs, who are very engaged and very closely aligned with farmers markets and with Whole Foods and a holistic concept, Whole Foods, and really carrying a farm to table, a locavore, seasonal locavore system forward. And that often, I have found, much to my discouragement, gets lost with sommeliers, the whole sommelier group. There's quite often a disconnect. And I think what people can do out there in general is all of us can continue to push for meeting those goals, having those goals together as an organization, even like that, and showing the way, giving them some reason, because you have tasty wine or whatever, tasty products, you have a reason for them to work and to integrate their own philosophy systems, so to come out with something that's whole. Otherwise, it's never made a lot of sense to me. So really just continuing to push everybody to engage and work and get people out there as well, and making time actually for employees to engage with visuals, with seminars, with paying for the time and for their engagement is I think helpful too. Haven't really mentioned the whole idea of safety and personal nutrition as well. So we all know one of the best soil models out there is basically our gut turned inside out, and trying to look at how we as healthy systems ourselves really are reflected or can be reflected in the story of healthy soils is pretty amazing. I used to be a nurse. I love all that stuff, and trying to share that with people, I think can be effective if they're interested. So
Wonderful.
Picture. Oh, I just wanted to say, pictures do, engage. We're trying to post more and more on Instagram, for example, and more social engagement, aligning with some of the targeting some of the social and press people out there who really are engaged themselves. It's really Elaine Brown comes to mind, for example. It's really a great champion, and aligning with those people is important.
Sure. Well, and we've been having most of the conversation focused on marketing, I would say at this point. I wanted to shift a bit more specifically to the economics of your business, and how your regenerative, soil health, organic, whatever your labels you use are, whatever those practices are, and also combating climate change, how all of that helps your bottom line or actually is economically feasible. I know that's a pretty big question, but take whatever piece of it you want. And I think that might be one of our last questions before we open it up to the audience. So just take a few minutes each for that, please.
I can start. I'm ashamed to say I don't really know. And I think that's one of the things that the RCD and Napa Green actually as well are trying to, as you really are the story of engaging with climate health, and is one of really having tools and looking at it as your balance sheet. I mean, if you're a bigger organization, you really do need to be able to justify and show that there's a relationship between your investment and that very, very small farm. It's sort of like, am I still solvent? which sounds frivolous and trite, but indeed, if it's all working, then it's coming back to you all the time. So I wish I had more tools. Part of it is being a small organization. We have found that we have actually tangibly been able to reduce, for example, our use of gasoline because we're crimping, we're lower tilling. We're certainly, in terms of conserving and partnering with native spaces, is really the theme here. And so looking at our water use and being dry farmed for the majority of the property, I think it certainly is saving us money, even if it's just electricity to pump from the well. So making sure that those systems are tight, you can see that in your water bill and in your electric bill going down. And that's those are good tools that you have in front of you to make sure that happens. And we know that happens. We know that our spray frequency is way down over the past few years, just because of the systems that we're putting in place.
Katie, we have 2 minutes left.
Great. I'll just let them all finish their answers, and we don't have too many questions yet in the Q&A, so feel free to keep populating those. Ryan, how about you go next?
I mean, I think where we can measure it is, we engage with PG&E grants and did energy efficiency upgrades, and that certainly is paying off. I mentioned all of our packaging, we moved it from sourcing glass from China and so on and so forth a couple years ago, which paid huge dividends when the pandemic hit and supply chains were disrupted in a huge way. We're still able to get those supplies to keep operating. That's like kind of the not sexy stuff that certainly pencils, and you can see in the near term. I think as it relates to healthy soils, I appreciated what Julie said, because I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, I don't know yet. I mean, I think we know that this is the future and where we need to go. As a small business, I think one of the most dangerous things you can do in some ways is play it too safe and try and be, like the status quo. And so I think we're really trying to invest to differentiate ourselves, and it pays dividends in engaging our employees, engaging the community, engaging customers. So it's hard to put a number on a lot of that stuff. And then ultimately, I think we all know this is where we need to go. And so starting to do that work now is a way to kind of amortize it over multiple years as we sort of step into it. So just in general, I'd say it's such a more powerful stance to stand for something rather than stand against something. And so I think that's what I'm hearing all these people say is like, how do we lean into that? And that sort of puts wind in your sails as just a stance in business. So hard to monetize it, hard to quantify it, but it's soul work. It does you good. It gets you out of bed in the morning.
Well, there's a lot of ways to approach this, but I guess I'll kind of pick up on what Julie said about dry farming. You know, I moved our vineyard, it's a hillside vineyard. I moved it to dry farming by choice about 6-7 years ago. At the same time, we also went with permanent cover, which is sort of really crazy. Nobody does permanent cover in dry farms, hillside vineyard. It's just, but it's doable. And it's made a difference from an economic standpoint, of course, because of the irrigation and the reduction in the number of vineyard passes, but also from a quality standpoint. The quality of the wines are really great. And it's also built in more resilience. So we built that more restorative capacity. In order to be able to dry farm, we went from 1% organic matter in our soils to 4%. So 3% increase, as Kelly said, would be, and his numbers could be 70,000 gallons of additional water holding capacity per acre. Well, that's huge. And particularly in a year like this, where the water has come quite sparingly, and we're fortunate that our soils do soak up the water, as Kelly was describing in his presentation. So those things on a really just a simple framework clearly make a difference. You know, I was just doing a consult for a vineyard yesterday or day before, I guess, and a big vineyard, several hundred acres on a really large property, all organic, probably one of the more beautiful vineyards and so beautifully managed vineyards that I've seen in a long time. All permanent cover, 100% permanent cover under the vines everywhere. They don't do a strip. Weed strip under the vine. Really, really, really fascinating. And what showed up for him is worms in the vineyard. Now, who talks about worms in the vineyard? I mean, I read a story about this guy, Claude Bourguignon in France, who talks a lot about it, but it just so makes sense. If you're creating that kind of healthy biome in your soil, now the worms are doing the work for you. And clearly we know how a worm works, right? And those castings actually start to build it up in the soil. So you're not out here doing your worm farm and then bringing over and then trying to spread it in a tea or something else. So any way that you can take what nature provides, i.e. the carbon or photosynthesis working its way down through the plant into the soil, or nitrogen, fixing plants, bringing nitrogen naturally into the soil, that it's sort of built into the nature of the dynamic of the system, then you're saving money, as Kelly also pointed to, all of those macronutrients and micronutrients that we think about all the time. How can you use the life force underneath the soil, just break those things down, make them available? All of that is an economic contribution. And if you can find a way to tell that story to whoever you're engaged with in the supply chain, ideally your consumers, that incites their interest, it definitely pays off. Solar power, we've got, most of our facilities have solar now, and it's huge. Some electric vehicles, we're starting with those. So all of those things are all of a contribution to the environment that brings health into the environment, that creates the opportunity for us to explore this thing called healthy soil.
Thank you so much. I'd like to just give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions too. Anya, do you have any questions for us?
I do. All right. So I will maybe start off with Julie for this one, but I'd appreciate it if the other panelists could chime in as well. In terms of terminology that you used, does using terms like biological or regenerative help where the big O word might be a kind of a block for some folks? So sort of what terminology do you see being a little bit more palatable on the market?
Well, that's become a catchword. I think helping define things. I mean, sustainability was one of those kind of toss away words. It was kind of the green wagon, get on the green bandwagon kind of word for a long time. And I think now we're all coming around to having it mean quite a bit more as we understand more about what it really means, and just talking about that with people. But Yeah, I think in general, I remember walking into the original Whole Foods market in Austin many years ago, and picking up a carrot for $4.98 a pound and kind of going, what? What does this all mean? So remember that when now we've got a lot of younger generation people coming up who really have been schooled in this, and they really are connecting those dots. So just helping connect the dots by giving them some of the definitions, I think is important. So I don't know. I'm trying on any, whatever it relates, however it relates to anybody. Natural is quite a bit more difficult because of the relationship to natural wine, whatever that is, for me. But we try on any level that we could get to. Like, here's the green thing. As somebody said to me the other day, all I get is that this is a fruity white wine. And I'm like, fine, this is great. We can take it from there. So,
yeah, this term, the term regenerative is somewhat, yeah, it's almost kind of replacing sustainable, as Julie points out. And I think there's a danger in that. I mean, I do think that there is a lot of really good movement inside of the conceptual framework of regenerative. Less inputs, less extraction, I think is basically the general idea. But inside of our industry, I've always felt that it just doesn't make any sense to tout your terroir if you're using some chemical, some synthetic that's damaging the health of your soil, and therefore the expression of the terroir. The organization that I linked up with recently and spending quite a bit of time expanding my understanding here is Regenerative Organic. And Regenerative Organic is organized around, one, your farming operations that need to be organically certified. And then on top of that, we've created this whole framework for what does it mean to be regenerative. And there's different practices that we engage in, but it also includes animal welfare. And the third leg of that is social justice. How are we treating our people? So in this country, we haven't engaged in that conversation yet. And so thankful to Patagonia and Bronner's and Rodeo, our partners in this process, is we're expanding the understanding and appreciation of regenerative. I simply describe regenerative as building the restorative capacity in the soil to help build resilience, whether it's resilience in your farm or resilience in the health of your community or resilience in our own health. We want to give value to the word regenerative, and I don't think we want to detract it. That's why we've coupled the two, because I don't think you can say you're building restorative capacity if you're still using synthetics.
Yeah, it is a loop, isn't it, Paul? I mean, it's a loop, and it's, so for some people they relate to it. It's a kumbaya. This is the kumbaya moment here that you're talking about, but it isn't authentic. I think what people really identify with is if they get pretty quickly, is this authentic? Are you just spinning something on me? So I think that's what you say is really important.
That's a very good point. So to take it from concept to practice, what do you all think would be the best policies or ways to encourage more folks, especially in the wine growing industry, to move towards these practices that are more regenerative? Are there ways that either organizations like the RCDs or other entities can support and encourage that, or even among your clients? And maybe I'll start with Ryan. Or you can pass if you.
I'm a passionate wine drinker, but I'm not in the wine space directly. I think in our space, what I'm most excited about, and just to your last question, in my space, organic is sort of like the standard, in the category that we sell in. So it's all very contextual about how this looks, but it's like grocery store kind of low bar organic. And so regenerative to me is an incredibly important part of the conversation. And metrics wise, but I think is going to ultimately push this the fastest is the work coming out of the Bionutrient Association, among others, of actually measuring nutrient density. And I think through time, what we'll find is a high correlation between healthy living soils that are sequestering carbon and much more quality. And so you could imagine if we unleash consumers out of the grocery store and they had a thing in their pocket that plugged into their cell phones and they could go crap, 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 good. like that's going to completely change the landscape, and certainly for buyers as well. So that's a little ways off, but not that far out. Like, so that's really heartening to me.
Yeah, I think there's actually been testing in strawberries to say higher strawberries with higher nutrient contents actually not only taste better, but they really, you know, organically grown strawberries really have more oomph, and underscores regenerative farming. I mean, grapevines really are, we have this incredible relationship with them. They are one of the most resilient and long-lived perennials that are out there, really. And the character, the idea of showing somebody a prune vine and an unpruned vine and said, can you believe this is going to happen again this year for the 50th year in a row? I mean, that's pretty, or for you, Paul, working 100 years in a row, you know, that's a great demonstration for people, I think, a great message.
Are you saying I'm 100 years old?
No, you're grapevines. Only if things are right. Only if you're making that happen for the soil.
Mm-hmm.
Soil health, you know, carbon sequestration throughout that vine. We're not just talking about, we're talking about the corks that we use. Connecting all those dots is really key, and the social element. There's not been, I think in CCOF, I love that organization dearly, but I think there's not a social justice, hasn't been a social justice piece in that, a safety piece in that, a farm worker, what happens when there's smoke and they lose their jobs for 2 months kind of piece. And that's important for us to include, I think, in all of this discussion.
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Paul, if you have.
I was going to say, there is definitely a higher level of consciousness that has arisen in the world of farming, but also in the world of wine. There are more and more, there's so many more folks farming organically and biodynamically inside of the wine industry now than ever were before. And so that there is some momentum, there's an understanding and appreciation of all of these elements that we've talked about today, from, you know, cover crop to compost to animal integration. But also what's interesting is there was just another study by a group of guys in, let me see, analysts, I guess, in France, and they analyzed all the wines that were rated in general, and then identified those that were organic and biodynamic, and they found that the organic and biodynamic wines rated 4 to 5 to 6 points higher than the regular population of wines. Same thing happened, the same kind of study happened here in the States about 7 or 8 years ago, same kind of numbers. But there is, Romani Conti, for God's sakes, is biodynamic, you know, the best wines in the world. So we will eventually discover and figure it out.
So we only have time for probably one more question. So I'm going to wrap it up with a quick little round robin of, do you think being able to communicate authenticity will require a third-party certification? Is that a necessary step for authentic to really translate to the customer? And maybe Julie, you could start us off.
I think that's a great standard. And I think maybe Paul, you taught me this. It's not necessarily so important, other than that your employees, your friends, your associates have to understand that you have a standard that you're adhering to. And I think that that's just almost as valuable as the actual thing. I mean, besides the fact it keeps you honest, I don't think that it actually means that much to people. But when you look at our industry versus any other industry, there are third-party standards for virtually every other manufacturing industry. And so it's not a foreign concept to people. I just thinking transferring it to something that's growing is something, but I think it's really important, and having some teeth in that annual visit, that annual audit, for example, is really important.
Paul, how about you? What are your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's an element of authenticity. It's an element of integrity. And when I say integrity, I mean more, not the more moral sense of it, but more the workability. If you're going to stand for something, as Julie says, then you have to find ways to validate that and guarantee that, and so that people can feel comfortable that they can trust. And absent that, then there becomes the question, the greenwashing that we had years ago, or the low level kind of backing into organic and not really fully engaged because you're just doing it for the marketing aspects of it. And it's not until you fully engage you're all in. It's not until you're all in that you can then start to fully explore the what's next and the what's missing. And just as this industry is starting to do, we heard for the last 2 days in this conversation. And one of the ways to do that is this regenerative organic that we're doing now, and suggesting that people do a social audit as well. All of this is expensive, but what will happen is this leadership organization that I've mentioned, Regenerative Organic Alliance, they're breaking the ground in order for it to be actually part of the network of activities that we're exploring in the way we operate. And then it will become part of the system in the future, where it will become more cost effective.
Great point. I think we're just about out of time, but Ryan, I can give you 30 seconds.
I would say, I would agree with everything that was said. It's a yes and, like, maybe that's the foundation that we build on. I mean, I think within the organic space, I'm really conflicted with a lot of things you can still put in your products that are quote unquote organic additives, natural flavors, really, really processed additives. And so I think using that as a foundation and for all of us to continue to build. And there is a part around access that I question with certifications. I love what Regenerative Organic is doing, but at this point, you have to be a relatively large brand to access that. And so even if you're not there, and for these smaller producers, still finding ways to authentically communicate with your customers, and for customers to be curious and kind of go beyond and not be complacent and go, oh, it's got the bug, and that's all good. I mean, I think we can all look at what happened with the non-GMO certification and market, and people conflating that with organic, and it just causing confusion. So yes, we need the certifications, and it's like we need curiosity, and we all need to strive above and beyond that as well.
Thank you all. And I really appreciated hearing Julie's thought about highlighting what you're actually doing and talk about that. I think that's an important step. And I'll pass it back to Miguel to close us out.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you to our panelists. This marks the end of the symposium. Over the last 2 days, we learned about the many challenges that climate change has been and will continue posing on the wine growing industry. But we also learn about the many ways you can address those challenges to enhance soil health. The great perspective from the many panel participants tells us that it is not only possible to farm sustainably in a region, but that it is the best thing you can do for your soil, and that you can make a profit while doing it. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and a special thanks to all the presenters for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us. And thanks to the NRCS and all of our partners. I would like to ask now all of the Soil Hub team members to turn on your cameras. This event simply would have not been possible without the hard work and dedication of every single one of you. The North Coast Resource Conservation Districts are here for you. Please reach out to your local RCD. We are always happy to hear from you. We hope everybody enjoyed the presentations and has something to take home. The North Coast Soil Hub will continue the hard work, and we will look forward to working with all of you to help you improve soil health, increase resiliency, stay ahead of the regulatory curve, save money, help the environment, and enhance marketability. The video from yesterday is now available on our website, and the video from today will be available early next week. In the incoming weeks, we will send you a survey to hear about your opinion about the symposium, and we would really appreciate it if you take the time to complete it. It will help us a lot to improve on our future symposiums. From all of us, thank you, and have a great day.
So Isis, how do you want to do this screenshot? Or did you do it already?
Yeah.
Did we get everybody? Do I have everyone?
I think we're on. Yeah, I'm just, if everyone wants to smile, maybe someone can do a countdown so we all look cute. And then, okay, 1, 2, 3.
Keep smiling.
Great.
I think we're good. Sorry, I forgot I was on. I forgot I could speak still. I got it. Do we want to do a silly one?
Nice.
Or not?
I don't have the energy to do a silly one.
Let's all take a rest. Good job, team.